Close your eyes for a moment, if you like, and listen not for a voice from far away, but for the quiet that gathers around a question that has haunted every civilization and every person who has looked at the horizon and wondered what lies beyond. What is death? Not simply a biological event, a set of neurons finally surrendering their signals, but a problem that unsettles what we call life, a boundary that folds us into time in a particular way. In this section, we will move with care through the many senses of death, tease apart the differences between the cessation of bodily life and the more intimate end of the self, and trace a map from ancient gardens and marble temples to the rooms of modern philosophy where dread, meaning, and possibility become the co-authors of a life lived under the shadow of mortality. This is not a single answer, nor a travel brochure to a final destination. It is a long inquiry, a patient looking, a listening to the tremor in the ground when the question of death is spoken aloud. To begin, we must separate two senses that often get merged in everyday talk: biological death and personal death, or what we might call the death of selfhood. Biological death is the end of the organism, the moment when the heart ceases to beat, the brain stops its electrochemical chatter, the body loses its capacity to sustain metabolism, and the organism becomes, in the most literal sense, non-living. It is a natural state, a part of life's cycle, the end of a particular organism's story. Personal death, by contrast, is the end of a life as a lived, felt, interpreted whole. It is the end of a subject's experience of the world, the cessation not only of pumping blood but of someone's capacity to have intentions, to make meaning, to interpret a sunrise or a child's smile, to respond to a joke, to tell a story about why a day matters. These two senses often converge in ordinary language, but philosophy invites us to disentangle them, to ask, does the death that matters to us philosophically belong to the body, to the person, or to something else, perhaps to the consciousness, perhaps to the self, as a locus of meaning-making? Let us define death across senses as a starting point. First, biological death, the cessation of fundamental life processes, cardiac activity, respiration, brain function, the collapse of the organism's ability to interact with the world through the senses. Second, personal death, the end of the life as a meaningful storyline for a particular conscious subject, the moment at which a person's hopes, memories, plans, and sense of being in the world can no longer be reconfigured or extended. Third, experiential or existential death, the sense of the self dissolving under the weight of despair, trauma, or despairing recognition that one's values, projects, or social roles can no longer be realized in the way they once could. The death of the self as a way of interpreting life, even while the organism continues to function physically for a time. Then there is the question of symbolic or social death, the ways communities mark, narrate, or erase a life after death, and how social memory preserves or edits what we call meaning. Ancient thinkers tended to blend the metaphysical with the physiological in ways that still shape our language. Epicurus, writing in a world before modern science, offers one of the sharpest and most controversial positions about death being nothing to us. He writes in the letter to Menocius, a text that has reverberated through centuries. Death is nothing to us. The key move is both simple and radical. If we are alive, death is not present. If death is present, we are not. There is, in other words, a boundary away from our own consciousness that makes the fear of death groundless. The fear arises in Epicurean eyes out of ignorance of what happens after life ends, and that ignorance is the source of pain. If we can purify our understanding that there is no sensation, no experience, no subject to suffer after we have ceased to exist, then death, though tragic in its consequences for those left behind, ceases to threaten the one who is alive. The paradox is not merely logical. It is a moral invitation to live without being consumed by the anticipation of non-being. We might sense a quiet subversiveness in this claim. The freedom to live is secured not by denying death, but by defanging its power to disrupt the present. Now turn to Socrates, whose courage in facing death is often cited as a model of philosophical. The story of his last days, recounted in the Phaedo, is not a loss of fear, but a transformation of fear into a disciplined acceptance. Socrates argues that death should neither be welcomed as a good in itself nor denigrated as an evil, for the wise man is unconcerned by what happens to the body once the soul has departed. In the dialogue, he offers a provocative account. Death is either a dreamless sleep or a migration of the soul to another place. If it is a sleep, it is a restful end. If it is a migration, it is a crossing into a different form of existence, where questions continue to be answered, and the soul engages in the life of the mind beyond the body. The deeper claim is not that death itself is good, but that death is not something to fear. To fear death is not a virtue, he seems to suggest, for it presumes you know what death is and that you know what life is worth. Socrates' stance is thus not an attempt to escape death through metaphysical guarantees, but to reframe death as a stage in the soul's ongoing inquiry. He even calls death a kind of purification, an instance of the soul shed of matter, a separation that clarifies what is essential. Aristotle's voice enters with a different grammar. If Epicurus and Socrates collect death within a framework of fear or absence, Aristotle treats death as a natural endpoint in the teleology of living beings. He believes in natural ends or tele that guide growth and development. The living organism pursues its proper end through its activities, nourishment, reproduction, growth, and eventually decay. Death is the end of the organism's ability to realize its ends. It is the universal fate of living things. But Aristotle's framework also offers a counterpoint to the Stoic insistence on constant courage in the face of death. He reminds us that living well is about the integrity of the whole life, not just its final moment. The human being, unlike other animals, aims at a higher good. Eudaimonia, flourishing that includes rational activity, virtue, and social life. Death interrupts those activities but does not simply negate the possibility of meaning. In this sense, death, for Aristotle, can be seen as a natural, inevitable boundary that invites the cultivated intellect to reflect on life's purposes, on the kind of life that deserves to be chosen in the time that remains. The Stoics enter the conversation with a mode of living that treats death as a regular occurrence in a cosmology of contingency. Epicurus and, later, Marcus Aurelius insist that we must train our souls to respond to loss in a disciplined, almost surgical way. The core strategy is precursors of cognitive therapy. Practice the removal of emotional misprisions by adjusting your judgments about death. If death comes, you have not truly lost anything you needed to possess. What you possessed you can present to the world in a state of serenity, and what you cannot carry with you remains a matter of indifferent circumstance. Marcus Aurelius's celebrated line, "Do not act as if you were going to live 10,000 years." Death hangs over you captures a stance. The horizon of mortality should condition every day. To live in the present, to treat every moment as a finite resource, is to live with the authentic gravity of time. The Stoic project does not erase fear. It converts fear into a disciplined attention to what truly matters: moral character, duties to others, and a rational alignment with the order of nature. Kierkegaard introduces a radically interior dimension to the problem. He invites us to consider anxiety, dread, and the leap of faith as responses to the unknown when confronted by the void. For Kierkegaard, anxiety is not simply a defect to be eliminated, but a condition that reveals freedom. The human spirit is thrown into a space where possibilities threaten the sense of self, and death is the ultimate horizon that intensifies this condition. The dread of the void makes novel possibilities visible, but it also risks paralysis. In Kierkegaard's vocabulary, the ethical life must find a way to live in the present with an understanding that the future is not guaranteed, that one story might end abruptly or continue in unexpected ways. The anxiety of finitude becomes the pressure that pushes the individual toward authenticity, toward a choice that is not merely a calculation of advantages, but a commitment to a path that could be true even in the absence of guarantees. Camus, writing in the aftermath of the world wars, confronts the sense of an absurd universe. There is, he says, no guaranteed meaning, no final plan that makes suffering worth it, no cosmic reward that will rescue a life from contingency. The naked fact of mortality becomes part of the absurd condition, yet Camus' response is not resignation but revolt. The recognition that there is no ultimate justification does not compel despair, but invites a personal decision about how to live. The life that refuses to give in to the demand for external justification can still be rich, meaningful, even joyful in the face of absurdity. In the myth of Sisyphus, Camus writes that the problem is whether we can imagine Sisyphus happy. The answer in his telling is yes. Happiness is found in the stance of perseverance, in choosing to embrace the struggle toward a horizon that cannot be finally secured. The approach to death here is radical autonomy. One can live with the knowledge of finitude by committing to a cause, to love, to engagement with others, to a project that remains valuable not because it is guaranteed to succeed, but because its pursuit feels worth the effort. Heidegger adds to the conversation with a metaphysical vocabulary that reframes death as an essential dimension of being. For him, human beings, Dasein, are defined by their relationship to their own finitude. Being toward death is the structure through which Dasein discloses itself authentically. Death is not just something that happens to individuals, it is the horizon that makes possibilities concrete, that makes choices decisive, that in a sense reveals what one truly wants to become. The very act of choosing is performed with the weight of mortality in the background. If one is able to face death with an honest sense of the finite nature of one's life, then life can be lived with more authenticity. Not as a refinement of fearlessness, but as an alignment with the truth of one's own existence. The courage that Heidegger prescribes is not bravado, but the acceptance that one's life is a finitely structured project that cannot be extended indefinitely by mere will. In this sense, death becomes not a threat, but a possibility that forces the self to choose its most genuine orientation toward being. Sartre tunes the conversation to the hinge of freedom in finitude. If there is no God, if there is no fixed cosmic plan, then human beings bear the burden of making meaning in a world that does not guarantee it. Death, as the ultimate limit, enhances the seriousness of choice. We grapple with our own finitude as the condition that makes us free. We are free because we must, in the sense that we cannot escape the fact that we will die. This is not a fatalistic resignation, but a call to act with responsibility and authenticity. Sartre's language, "man is condemned to be free," reminds us that the absence of a guarantee does not annihilate possibility. It intensifies the weight of responsibility, the gravity of the present moment, and the necessity to assume ownership of one's values and actions. In the end, for Sartre, death is not a mere biological end, but a horizon that tests moral resolve and clarifies what it means to live as a being who chooses rather than merely reacts. In traversing these thinkers, we encounter core concepts that recur in surprising forms: finitude, meaning-making under mortality, dread and acceptance, consciousness of death, and the crucial distinction between biological death and the death of selfhood. Finitude is a given, an undeniable boundary we cannot escape, but finitude does not simply crush the life of the mind, it becomes the very material with which meaning is carved. The problem of meaning in mortality is not a search for a permanent refuge, but a discipline. How to live with an awareness that the end may come tomorrow, next year, perhaps in the midst of ordinary days when the phone rings and a friend laughs, when a patient's chart changes, when a near miss reminds one of fragile luck. The dread that accompanies mortality is not only fear of non-being, it is the fear of a life not well used, a life that leaves out what matters, a life that looks back with regret and wonders what could have been if only one had chosen differently. Acceptance in many of these thinkers is not a passive surrender but a cultivated stance, a way of aligning desires with the finite time one possesses, so that the self does not become a museum of postponed intentions, but a living testament to what one has chosen to welcome into being. To ground these abstract strands, consider a pair of real-world situations that philosophers often deploy as thought experiments. The first concerns a terminally ill patient, a person whose body shows the signs of a slow, inexorable decline, where abilities wane and values must be renegotiated as the end approaches. The second concerns a healthy person who experiences a near miss, a car accident, or a sudden medical scare that jolts the ordinary sense of safety and invites immediate reflection on what truly matters. In both cases, mortality interrupts normal rhythms and forces a reevaluation of priorities. The terminally ill patient may confront the erosion of autonomy, the difficulty of maintaining meaning when vitality is compromised, and the need to reconstitute selfhood around new limits. The near-miss survivor may experience a heightened sense of the present, a sudden reprioritization of relationships, and a reckoning with the fragility of the future. These cases illuminate the distinction between biological death and death of selfhood. Even when the body remains, the sense of self may be rearranged, the self's projects may be recalibrated, and the meaning of everyday acts, breathing, speaking, listening to a friend, may gain a different texture. In one case, death is a silent, steady rumor at the edge of consciousness. In the other, a sudden, almost dizzy clarity about what one values. Consider a terminally ill patient who, with the help of palliative care, refines a sense of life's meaning in the face of decline. The fear of dying is not erased, rather the fear is confronted with a redefinition of what counts as a worthy life. A person might choose to prioritize presence, being with family, sharing stories, passing along wisdom, offering forgiveness or gratitude, creating small rituals that mark the days, even the final ones. Values shift, the career ambitions that once defined success may recede, replaced by a deepened commitment to companionship, tenderness, and the ethics of care. The body's limitations become teachers rather than adversaries. Fatigue, pain, breathlessness all demand patience and attention. The self, once expansively oriented toward future goals, learns to inhabit the present moment with a different kind of gravity. Epicurus would remind us that death is nothing to us while we live, but the thoughtful reading of his claim must recognize that the meaning of life is never simply an abstract proposition. It arises in action, in intimate, concrete choices under the shadow of mortality. The question then emerges, if death is nothing to us in an absolute sense, How then should one live given the fragile, temporary nature of bodily life? Now imagine the healthy person who experiences a near miss, a car accident, or a sudden medical scare that jolts perception of risk and time. The immediate shock is not merely physical, it is existential. The person may discover a heightened clarity about what to value: relationships, opportunities to repair or deepen connections, the courage to say what has been unsaid, the resolve to undertake a long-delayed project, or the decision to withdraw from pursuits that feel empty in light of the risk of loss. A near miss can also intensify dread, a sense that time has compressed and the future is more uncertain than before. Camus might say that the person now lives with a recognition of the absurd, the sense that while life is continuous, its significance is not guaranteed by external structures. One must create value in the face of contingency, yet there is also a hopeful strain in such moments. Mortality becomes a sparring partner who refuses to grant the luxury of a long procrastination. The individual may choose, in a Camusian mood, to live more fully, not because death makes life meaningful by itself, but because the risk of death makes every choice feel more real, more accountable, more ours. Counterarguments to these frames are essential. One might offer the naturalistic claim that death clarifies life. By exposing the finitude of time, death sharpens values, prunes away trivialities, and helps an individual realize what truly matters. The argument runs like this: without death, life might drift. Mortality functions as a stern tutor who compels us to weigh what to pursue, what to accept, and what to discard. If we accept this line of reasoning, then death has a positive function, a kind of internal constraint that helps to refine the soul's itinerary. Yet this argument risks presupposing that clarity depends on fear or on the sense of elimination. It risks making meaning dependent on a threat that cannot be neutralized by reason alone. The second counterargument centers on immortality or continuity of consciousness as necessary to preserve the value of human life. If our minds could continue after death, or if memory and identity could be preserved indefinitely, perhaps the stakes of action would be different. We might pursue longer-term goods, guarantee kinship, satisfy the longing for an enduring self. But such claims face serious philosophical obstacles. They require a theory of personal identity across time and across a dissolution of the body that is not empirically secure. They also raise questions about whether the value of our actions is preserved if the horizon of time can be extended indefinitely. The argument for immortality tends to default to a form of moral risk management. If we want to keep the value of our commitments, perhaps we need a horizon that guarantees their completion. The danger, of course, is that belief in immortality can distort the present, encouraging us to defer critical work to some future state or to export responsibility into an afterlife. To illuminate the conversation with historical anecdotes, two moments stand out in the Greco-Roman and Renaissance arcs that still resonate. First, Socrates' death by hemlock, a deliberate, chosen acceptance of the penalty that followed his trial. The scene is more than a legal tragedy, it is a ritual of philosophy. The act of drinking the poison becomes a protest against a world that would quiet inquiry by force. Socrates' final reflections emphasize the harmony of life with a larger pursuit of truth. The end of his physical life does not erase the life of the mind he cultivated. The memory of that moment has fueled countless discussions about the proper attitude toward death: to die with dignity as a seeker of truth, to align the soul's aims with the pursuit of the good, and to regard death as a gateway rather than a terminus. A second anecdote lives in the imagery of memento mori in Renaissance art. Skulls and hourglasses appear in paintings and sculpture as a reminder that beauty, wealth, and status are fleeting, and that the human body itself is a temporary vessel destined for decay. The memento mori tradition is not merely a cynical reminder of death, it is a disciplined invitation to live with intention, to use time wisely, to cultivate virtue, and to reflect on what one would leave behind. Cross-referencing with other ideas deepens the discussion. The Stoics, for instance, share a thread with Buddhist notions of impermanence. Both traditions emphasize the instability of conditions, the rising and falling of states, the changing nature of desires, and the practice of letting go. The Buddhist doctrine of anatta, or non-self, complements the Stoic aim of detachment in the face of life's losses. It invites us to see selfhood as a constructed narrative, a convenient center for experience rather than an enduring soul that persists unchanged. The idea of impermanence aligns with the existential meditation on finitude. Both challenge the self as a fixed, permanent point of reference and urge a flexible, adaptive stance in the face of change. Plato's discussions of the soul's immortality, in dialogue with the argument for the soul's separation from the body, provide a contrast within the same tradition. An eternal soul promises continuity beyond physical death, but the price is a metaphysical claim that must be defended against empirical and phenomenological concerns. The link to phenomenology, especially the work of Husserl and Heidegger, is immediate. Death here is not merely a bodily event but a structure of experience, a horizon that shapes every moment of perception, intention, and memory. Dasein's being toward death is a way of rereading lived experience as finite, a lens that reveals what one truly is and what one truly desires. In this long arc, the modern voices add their own pressure and nuance. Kierkegaard's insistence on the subjective, individual response to the dread of finitude pales some of the universal claims of the ancients into more intimate territory. The fear of meaninglessness, the choice to leap toward faith, or the stubborn refusal to surrender to the void through authentic commitment to a personal project. Camus, in a sense, radicalizes this stance by insisting that meaning cannot come from outside. It is manufactured in the face of an indifferent cosmos, and death is a reminder that we do not and cannot be guaranteed satisfaction or coherence from a cosmos that plays with us by not furnishing a final answer. Heidegger's being toward death, meanwhile, reframes mortality not as a problem to solve, but as a phenomenological structure that reveals what it means to be in the world with a finite horizon. And Sartre, returning to the radicalism of freedom, insists that even the shadow of death does not determine our choices. Rather, the awareness of finitude heightens responsibility, makes every act a decision about who we want to be in a world without guaranteed meaning. To deepen the analysis, let us tilt our ear to a few close readings of core passages and to thought experiments that anchor these ideas in the texture of daily life. We can convene a short, close reading of Epicurus' letter. The crucial sentence, "Death is nothing to us," is not a simple negation. It is a permission to focus on priority. It is not a claim that death will never matter to us as individuals, but that the moment of death is not an event we experience because our experience ends before it arrives. If we accept this, we must then ask, what is the value of fear if fear presupposes something within us that can still experience? Is fear of death simply a melodrama of the still living mind that clings to control? Epicurus would say yes, in effect. Fear is an unnecessary pain layered on top of pain, a mental habit that misreads the boundaries of sensation and existence. Yet the same text invites a more careful reading. If we can internalize the lack of experience after death, we may find ourselves freed to focus on how to live here and now, rather than diluting our energy by anticipating the end. A close reading of Socrates in Phaedo reveals a different texture of the issue. The dialogues present a stance that is both metaphysical and ethical. Death is not simply the end of experience. It is a condition that tests the integrity of one's philosophical life. If the body distracts the soul with bodily appetites, then death is a release, a purification enabling the soul to ascend toward truth. The fear of death, if one is a philosopher, is a sign of misplaced priorities. One has not neglected desire long enough, one has not practiced the loosened grip on the world. The philosophical life, in Socrates' sense, is a preparation for death in the sense that it trains the soul to see beyond the body's contingencies. The migration of the soul after death is a vivid image of the soul's continued activity, which for a philosopher becomes a hopeful horizon rather than a mere threat to be avoided. In the Stoic passages, consider Marcus Aurelius' admonition to live with the awareness that death is imminent. The line, often quoted to mark the stoical posture, compresses a robust theory into a single sentence. Do not assume perpetual life, for death is always near. The practice implied here is not a grim endurance but a deliberate orientation, to order one's life so that death does not undo what has already been well ordered. If a person has set their values, cultivated virtue, and built meaningful relationships, a sudden end preserves those goods in the sense that they were already grasped in real actions rather than left as aspirations. The experience of death in this sense tests coherence, not merely of personal beliefs but of daily conduct. Kierkegaard's anxiety, in contrast to the Stoic composure, arises not only from fear of death but from freedom's burden. When faced with the possibility of non-being, a person must decide what to become. The choice reveals the self's authenticity. The dizziness of freedom is not a comfortable sensation. It is a moral pressure that asks whether one will live by the truth of one's own commitments or seek safety in conventional roles and assurances. The leap of faith, for Kierkegaard, is not an escape from death but a way to live with it in view, to commit to values that might outlast the body but not transcend the very necessity of choosing. Camus, writing in a different key, confronts meaninglessness in a world without guaranteed purpose and without a guarantee of a cosmic plan. The absurd hero faces death with an unwavering insistence on living fully here and now. The lines in the myth of Sisyphus, "One must imagine Sisyphus happy," offer a paradoxical suggestion. Even under the weight of endless, pointless repetition, there is room to assert meaning by choosing one's stance toward the rock, toward the hill, toward the labor itself. The human stance against death's ultimate horizon is thus not primarily philosophical abstraction, but lived practice. To rebel against the absurd by a life of sincerity, solidarity, and responsibility toward others. Heidegger's ontology pushes this into a more technical register, but with a human face. The idea of being toward death invites us to recognize the way mortality shapes even our most ordinary experiences. When we walk down a street and notice another person, we do so with an acknowledgement that each moment could be our last, not as a morbid preoccupation, but as a radical commitment to the present. Death becomes the limit of all possibilities as well as the condition for authentic choice. If one accepts that the future is finite and precarious, one can choose to invest in what truly matters rather than in what is merely convenient. Sartre's existentialism adds the ethical pressure of responsibility. Death is the horizon that makes freedom real, not a tyrant. If one can own the world's meaning through choices, then even a finite life can carry immense weight. A short thought experiment can help us feel the force of these distinctions. Imagine a hypothetical device, a perfect recorder that could copy every sensation, memory, and thought from a person's life and store it beyond death so that nothing is lost. If such a recorder existed, what would change about how we live? If your last memory could be captured and replayed, would fear of oblivion vanish, or would fear become worse, because now you know the exact shape of the void? If, on the other hand, you could reattach memory to a future body or a different form of consciousness, would that redefine the self? Some would argue that such a device would undermine the very thing that gives life its seriousness. The fact that the present moment is a one-time harbor that cannot be fully transported into a post-mortem archive. Others might say that the possibility of memory preservation would render death less existentially urgent, allowing a different kind of moral calculus about how to spend one's days. Either way, the thought experiment pushes us to distinguish between the fear of dying and the fear of losing meaning, the fear of the body and the fear of the self, and the way memory, identity, and continuity shape our understanding of what death means. As we explore these ideas, a few cross-references can enrich the map. The Stoic emphasis on controlling one's judgments dovetails with Buddhist practice in contemplating impermanence and the self's mutability. In Buddhism, impermanence, anicca, and the idea of non-self, anatta, invite a suspension of the fear that arises from clinging to a fixed sense of self. This does not deny the reality of suffering or death, but reframes the self as a process rather than a fixed essence, which changes how one responds to mortality. The Platonic tradition, with its confidence in the soul's immortality, offers a contrasting path, an enduring self that can persist beyond the body, potentially explaining a sense of moral responsibility that continues after death. Yet Platonic immortality also raises questions about the nature of the afterlife and whether the soul's intervention in future lives can be known. The phenomenological approach to death, advanced by Heidegger and later thinkers, treats death as a structural aspect of experience. It is not a mere event, but an existential dimension that informs how we structure our projects, commitments, and daily life. The cross-pollination of these ideas reveals a conversation that spans metaphysics, ethics, and the phenomenology of perception. How we experience death shapes how we live, and how we live defines what death means to us. Guidance for expansion into a longer exploration should therefore proceed along several lines. First, immerse in close readings of key passages and primary texts, attending to the nuances in rhetoric, metaphor, and argument. The letter to Menocius, the Phaedo, Marcus Aurelius Meditations, Kierkegaard's works of love or fear and trembling, Camus' myth of Sisyphus, Heidegger's being in time, and Sartre's being in nothingness all offer windows into the shape of the problem, while not surrendering to any single solution. Second, contrast ancient and modern framings of death by placing them in cultural contexts. The Greek city-state's honor codes and the tragedy of fate, the Roman Stoic Republic's practical ethics. The Christian medieval and Renaissance reconfigurations of mortality through salvation narratives and memento mori. The modern scientific revolution's insistence on naturalistic explanations and the phenomenology of lived experience. Third, incorporate short thought experiments designed to illuminate the difference between biological death and the death of selfhood. For a moment, consider whether a person who has undergone profound psychological transformation could die to their previous self while the body remains intact. Or whether a person who experiences a complete cognitive rewrite could remain alive but become another person altogether. Fourth, invite the audience to reflect through prompts. What would a life spoken into the shadow of death look like for you? How does fear or acceptance shape daily choices? In what ways might a mature, philosophically informed acceptance of finitude alter our relationships, our ambitions, our capacity for forgiveness, and our commitments to truth-telling, care, and justice? To continue insisting on the primacy of narrative memory and personal testimony, we should weave in a few more historical anecdotes and cross-references. The shift from Epicurean caution about pain to Stoic endurance to existentialist responsibility reveals how each era tries to bear the weight of mortality with a distinct mood. In the Renaissance, the rise of memento mori imagery is not merely a morbid fascination with the skulls and hourglasses. It is a cultural practice that seeks to convert mortality into a daily discipline. The reminder that all things pass, and that the way one remembers and acts in the face of this passing constitutes a life well lived. The anecdote of the artist who, upon finishing a painting, places a skull next to the canvas to remind himself that beauty's aura fades is not just a curiosity of style. It is a practical ethics in which art becomes a training for living with awareness of time's limitation. Let us also expand the cross-references to remind ourselves that death is not a closed topic but an intersectional one. The Stoic emphasis on virtue and resilience intersects with Buddhist contemplative approaches to death as a teacher of impermanence. The Platonic claim of the soul's immortality offers a metaphysical promise that some find comforting, while the existential and phenomenological critiques ask whether such a promise can bear the weight of lived experience without becoming a denial of mortality's immediacy. The modern emphasis on death anxiety in clinical psychology and palliative care shows that this debate remains not only theoretical but deeply practical. How might individuals and communities cultivate a humane, ethical approach to dying, to grieving, and to the care of those who are dying? The cross-disciplinary connections from ethics and metaphysics to psychology, theology, and medicine reveal the enduring relevance of these questions. In terms of examples to ground the philosophical claims, we can return to the two scenarios introduced earlier and extend them with more concrete portraits. The terminally ill patient might be someone who, after a long life of achievement in a demanding field, discovers a new vocation in mentorship or in sharing a personal story that reveals a different understanding of what makes life meaningful. Perhaps this person writes letters to younger colleagues, not to leave behind guidance on technique, but to impart wisdom about intention, humility, and gratitude. The patient might cultivate rituals that celebrate ordinary joys, a cup of tea, a favorite book, a daily walk in a garden, turning each moment into a deliberate choice to acknowledge its finite nature. The experience of pain and decline does not necessarily produce cynicism. It can intensify tenderness and the ethical sense of responsibility toward others. Epicurus would push toward the quiet insight that fear is a product of misapprehension and that freedom comes from understanding what death cannot take away. The capacity to choose one's attitude toward life's final chapters. For the near-miss healthy person, the turning point might be less about accepting decline and more about reprioritizing risk and time. The near-miss can provoke a retelling of life's story, a reconsideration of the kinds of risks one is willing to take, and a re-anchoring of values toward what one finds most worth defending and pursuing in the years that remain. The moment of crisis, an instant in which one's body could have failed, exposes the fragility of everyday safety and invites a lucid inventory of one's commitments, to family, to truth, to beauty, to justice, to service. Camus' insistence on living with the knowledge of the absurd reframes despair as an ethical energy rather than a destination. The near miss becomes a clarifying event, a forcing action that compels attention to the present, to the people who matter now, to the responsibilities one can still fulfill, to the ways one can resist the drift toward meaninglessness that a comfortable life can invite. We should not neglect the question of whether the argument requires a belief in an afterlife or a metaphysical guarantee to be compelling. Some readers might feel that belief in some form of continued consciousness beyond death is essential to justify the weight of moral and personal commitments. Others will insist that true significance is realized precisely because it is finite and fragile, and that to demand more than finite meaning is to demand a guarantee that the universe does not offer. The debate about immortality versus finitude is not merely a religious or metaphysical debate. It is a practical question about how one makes choices, how one bears sorrow, how one loves, and how one passes on what matters to others. The thinker who accepts finitude without succumbing to nihilism can learn to live with a resilient, generous urgency that does not crumble under the heavy certainty of death, but uses that certainty as a lever to pry open more humane and more purposeful living. Finally, we should leave room for the question that organizes the whole discussion. How does fear or acceptance shape daily choices? The fear of death can be paralyzing, but it can also be mobilizing when viewed through the lens of a philosophical practice that seeks to align action with a meaningful understanding of mortality. The acceptance of death does not preclude sorrow, it does not erase the pain of loss. Instead, it can reframe pain as a testimony to what matters. The approach to death, then, is a matter of how one aligns with the truth of one's life, how to live while living in the daily presence of finitude. In closing, the story of death in philosophy is not a linear progression from fear to acceptance, from ignorance to knowledge, from despair to peace. It is a conversation across centuries and across schools of thought about what it means to exist as finite beings who nonetheless yearn for meaning, connection, and dignity. The early claims, death being nothing to us, the possibility of a fearless death, the natural end of life, the moral practice of facing loss, continue to echo in a world that feels both ancient and urgent. The Stoics remind us that we can cultivate resilience by adjusting our judgments. Kierkegaard invites us to accept the truth of our freedom, even as it unsettles us. Camus challenges us to fight for meaning without guarantees. Heidegger asks us to see death as the horizon that reveals what it means to be. Sartre insists that death does not merely end possibility, but clarifies the stakes of every decision. These are not competing answers. They are parts of a larger conversation about what it means to live and what it means to die. As you listen, you might test your own intuitions against these arguments. Consider your own life. What would a life spoken into the shadow of death look like for you? How does fear or acceptance shape your daily choices? What would you have to change in your relationships, your work, your commitments, if you knew that time was finite in a precise and unalterable way? If you could speak to a future version of yourself after death, what would you want that version to know about the life you chose to live? And if a near miss or a terminal decline enters your story, how would you want to respond? Gentle acceptance, fierce advocacy for a cause you love, or perhaps a mixture of both, an ethical art of living that refuses to be defeated by the final pass of the hourglass. In the quiet of this exploration, let us recall the two practical anchors we've used to ground the discussion: the distinction between biological death and death of selfhood, and the necessity to examine how mortality shapes value, choice, and community. We have traversed a historical arc from Epicurus' serene courage in the face of nothingness, to Socrates' meditations on death as a form of purification, to Aristotle's natural ends and the teleology of living things. To the moral discipline of the Stoics, to Kierkegaard's anxiety and the leap toward authenticity, to Camus' revolt against the absurd, to Heidegger's phenomenology of being toward death, and to Sartre's insistence on freedom within finitude. In each case, death is not merely a conclusion but a partner in the human experiment, the horizon that gives shape to life, the boundary that tests our commitments, and the context in which we decide what to hold as valuable. If you take one thing from this long inquiry, let it be this: mortality is not a problem to be solved once and for all, it is a condition to be inhabited with care. The claim that life is finite, that meaning must be created in a world without guaranteed purpose, is not a gloomy verdict but a summons to responsibility. It asks us to decide who we will be, what we will do, and how we will treat others in the face of time's inexorable advance. It invites us to practice living with intention, to cultivate the virtues that endure when breath and strength fail, and to build communities that support those who walk toward the end of the road. The philosophical problem of death thus becomes, in its deepest form, a problem of living, how to align courage, tenderness, honesty, and fidelity in a life that will, in the end, bend toward stillness. And in that alignment, perhaps we discover not merely how to endure death, but how to live with a kind of reverence for life itself, a life that persists in memory, in influence, in the relationships we cherish, and in the stories we tell to those we leave behind. If you carry these thoughts into your daily practice, you may notice that fear recedes not by denial, but by a more exact embrace of the present's weight. You may find that love deepens when you recognize its finitude, that courage grows when it is anchored in a lucid acceptance of the ends of things, and that small acts of care, a patient listening, a genuine apology, a moment of quiet presence, become the heart of a life well lived precisely because they are chosen under the gaze of mortality. The conversation is not over, it is ongoing, renewed each day in acts of attention and responsibility. The philosophy of death invites us to cultivate a life that can hold mortality with integrity, to honor the memory we will leave behind, and to continue, with humility and courage, toward whatever horizon remains available to us. And so we continue with a light, attentive voice, with a patient listening for the tremor of end and meaning alike, with the assurance that the deepest questions about death are not distant or abstract, but intimate and immediate in every moment we choose to live fully. To close, I invite you to return to your own reflections. Sit a while and imagine the weight of the days ahead as a finite resource you can spend only once. How would you spend it differently if you knew the hour of departure could be today, or a year hence, or decades away? What stories would you tell to the people you love if you knew that this might be the last conversation? Consider a life spoken into the shadow of death, and let your question lead you toward what you hope to become. The inquiry remains open, the road continues, and mortality, whether we accept it, fear it, or labor to transform it into meaning, will keep returning as a faithful teacher. In the space between fear and acceptance, in the quiet corner where courage and tenderness meet, we may discover the forms of life that death, in its various senses, has helped to illuminate. And perhaps in that illumination we find not the end of life's worth but a more intimate understanding of what it means to live and to die with integrity. In the quiet hours of thinking about death, we begin not with a policy sheet but with a human insistence. That life, when it has gathered its meanings around us, deserves a conversation about how it should end. The ethics of death is not a single verdict but a chorus of questions that echo through our beliefs about autonomy, responsibility, relief from suffering, and the value we place on every living moment. In this segment we wander through origins and ideas, traverse contested ground, look at real laws and real lives, and listen for the tensions that arise when a patient asks to end life, when a doctor weighs the next breath against the last, and when a culture weighs the sanctity of life against the relief that might come with dying. We will move from abstract duty to concrete decision, from the long arc of history to the sharp edge of a bedside decision, and we will try to keep our ears open to both the quiet dignity of restraint and the urgent call for relief. Let us begin with the oldest question in Western moral reflection. What does it mean to treat a person as an end, and not merely as a means when life itself seems to ask for a different kind of end? The Kantian bedrock is a gesture of respect that becomes timbre for the conversation about death. Immanuel Kant does not speak about euthanasia in a casual aside. He speaks about humanity as an end in itself, never as a tool for someone else's purposes. The famous imperative, act in such a way that you treat humanity, whether in your own person or in the person of any other, always at the same time as an end and never merely as a means, places dignity at the core of moral action. When a patient faces the choice to end suffering, the Kantian lens asks, is the person being used as a means to a relief that bypasses the person's own judgment and value of rational beings? Or is the decision rooted in the person's capacity to deliberate in freedom, to recognize the ends that matter most to them, and to act in a way that respects both their rational agency and their inherent worth? In practice, Kantian ethics emphasizes the autonomous authority of a competent person to decide how to bear or relieve suffering. Yet it also prompts a protective instinct. Autonomy without a safety net can become coercion or a kind of violence against the vulnerable, those who may be depressed, exhausted by pain, or culturally pressured to choose a path they would not have chosen under different conditions. The Kantian framework thus yields at least two robust lines of argument in end-of-life scenarios. First, autonomy as a duty to respect rational agency. Second, a duty to prevent coercive or incompetent choices, to ensure that any decision to end life is not a capitulation to social pressure, economic distress, or medical paternalism. The first push argues that a person should be allowed to determine the shape of their final chapter. The second insists on safeguarding the decision against manipulation or despair masquerading as freedom. Then we turn to the utilitarian horizon. The utilitarian frame, associated most strongly with John Stuart Mill, demands that we ask what action tends to maximize happiness or minimize suffering for all affected. In a death ethics context, that means weighing the relief of unbearable suffering against the possible harms, the risks of a slippery slope, the impact on family, the potential devaluation of life, or the societal costs of normalizing a practice that could be misused. The utilitarian calculus is not a single number but a balancing act. If a patient endures unrelieved pain that seems to hollow out the sense of a meaningful life, removal of that pain may generate net happiness. If, on the other hand, the policy of permitting end-of-life relief leads to a broad erosion of trust in medicine, or to vulnerable people feeling pressured to pick death as a means to avoid burdening others, the happiness calculus shifts, perhaps significantly. Mill's language, actions are right in proportion as they tend to promote happiness, invites us to scrutinize not only the outcome for the patient, but also the consequences for relationships, for the medical profession's ethos, and for social norms surrounding care and dying. But the utilitarian's soft spot is clear. Predictions about consequences are fragile, and the moral weight of a single patient's life cannot be reduced to a statistical projection. Hence, two powerful lines of argument unfold. One visceral counterpoint to utilitarian relief is the sacred sense that life has value beyond the balance sheet of pain and pleasure. From Aristotle's virtue ethics, we learn that a good life is not just a sequence of pleasures subdued by pain, but a life of flourishing, a living well shaped by character, habituation, and a stable sense of what virtue requires in pursuit of eudaimonia. For Aristotle, the emphasis is not on a momentary relief of discomfort, but on the cultivation of a character that confronts suffering with courage, patience, and practical wisdom. A virtue ethics approach to end-of-life decisions asks us to consider what kind of person a patient would be in the face of death if they choose to endure and to sustain a meaningful life through palliative means, and what kind of patient a person would be if they choose to hasten death as a form of mastery over fate. The virtue framework does not merely weigh the pain against relief. It invites a broader reflection on what living well looks like in the final chapters, what kind of closure is dignified, and how one's end may reveal or develop character in ways that are themselves ethically meaningful. A second tradition to pull into the discussion is the social contract and rights-based approach. The contractarian line, thinkers who foreground mutual obligation, consent, and the conditions under which persons grant power to authorities, illustrates how end-of-life choices intersect with societal norms, trust in institutions, and protections against coercive use of power. In this frame, the question becomes, what minimal protections must be in place to honor voluntary decisions about dying while ensuring that those decisions are not imposed by social pressures, medical authority, or economic coercion? A rights-based account emphasizes respect for patient autonomy as a moral entitlement, but it also demands safeguards that protect vulnerable individuals from coercion, misrepresentation, or the failings of medical systems that might push a particular outcome for the sake of resource allocation or professional convenience. The contractarian lens thus foregrounds processes, advance directives, clear voluntary requests, time for reflection, second opinions, and the presence of a credible social contract that assigns responsibilities to doctors, families, and policymakers to prevent coercion and preserve trust. A further deeply influential voice in this landscape is Derek Parfit, whose work in Reasons and Persons reframes what matters when a person dies. Parfit's focus is not on whether a body persists, but on what matters in the future that would have existed for that person. If what matters most is the continuation of the person's valuable experiences and projects, then the ethical weight of ending life hinges on whether you are destroying something valuable, or whether the future that would have been lived matters less because the person has already fulfilled critical aims in this life, or because a future of less value would follow anyway. Parfit's insights invite a nuanced debate about personal identity, potential futures, and whether the moral weight of death is tied to empirical possession of a future life or to the quality and significance of the person's ongoing projects, relationships, and meanings. The future of persons argument helps us pressure test the intuition that every death is a cosmic loss, by asking whether that loss is essential to moral value or contingent on contingent features of what one's life would have become. Another important line comes from Peter Singer, who asks us to consider capacity and suffering as morally relevant criteria for action. Singer's emphasis on reducing suffering and his insistence that moral status should depend on the capacity to experience pain and pleasure lead him to a provocative, sometimes controversial stance. Where suffering is severe and intractable, relief may be morally permissible and even required. Yet Singer's framework also warns against allowing suffering to be the sole metric adopted by the powerful, reminding us that the capacity for suffering is distributed unequally across species and across social circumstances. A Singerian reading presses us to consider not only the patient's autonomy and relief, but also the broader ethical consequences. Does a policy of assisted dying affect how society distributes resources for palliative care, or how it views aging, disability, and the vulnerable? These theoretical threads, Kant's dignity and autonomy, Mill's happiness calculus, Aristotle's flourishing through virtue, contractarian and rights-based protections, Parfit's future of persons reasoning, and Singer's emphasis on capacity and suffering, do not stand in isolated rooms. They cross in the corridor of policy and practice, and they illuminate the central core issues of our time. Voluntary euthanasia, physician-assisted suicide, withdrawal of life-sustaining treatment, palliative and hospice care, and the ethics of withholding versus withholding aid. Let us step into those issues with the same careful attention we brought to the big theories, and let us also accompany them with actual cases, laws, and practices that have shaped how people die in recent decades. Consider first voluntary euthanasia and physician-assisted suicide, which are often grouped together but raise distinct questions. Involuntary euthanasia, a physician administers a lethal agent to a terminally ill patient at the patient's voluntary and well-considered request. In physician-assisted suicide, the patient self-administers the lethal agent that a physician has supplied. Two arguments for autonomy push in this direction. First, there is the clear claim that competent adults ought to have control over the timing and manner of their death when faced with unbearable suffering, reduced autonomy in the face of illness, or the sense that life has lost its meaningful value. The second argument is framed as relief from suffering. If the relief is real and durable, and if it can be achieved without coercion, it might be morally permissible, even prudent, to allow a patient to access life-ending options. The decisive counterarguments emphasize the fragility of autonomy under distress, the risk of coercion or misinterpretation of suffering as a sign that life has become worthless, and the social costs. The normalization of death as a solution to illness, the possible undervaluation of life in elder care, and the potential for pressure from families or institutions to opt for death because it is cheaper or easier. Two core counterarguments are often deployed. Sanctity of life is a robust and ancient line of reasoning that resists the idea that suffering determines the moral value of ending life. Religious, cultural, or deeply held moral convictions can hold that life has an intrinsic value that should not be deliberately terminated, regardless of suffering. A second strong counterargument is the slippery slope concern. Even if euthanasia or assisted suicide is initially permitted under stringent safeguards, over time norms may shift. What begins as voluntary and well-considered may gradually expand to include people who feel pressured by social circumstances, those who are depressed, the elderly who feel they have become burdens, or patients whose prognosis is uncertain but who fear prolonged pain or medical interventions. The fear is that once the door opens, the threshold for what counts as a permissible death may lower, and vulnerable people, those with disabilities, those with limited social supports, those who are poor, may end up bearing a disproportionate burden of the decision to die. To understand how these arguments play out in practice, we need to look at concrete case studies, laws, and medical practices. In the Netherlands and Belgium, euthanasia and physician-assisted suicide have been legal under carefully guarded conditions for many years. The Dutch law insists on a due care standard, that the physician must be convinced that the patient's request is voluntary and well considered, that the patient's suffering is unbearable with no prospect of relief, that the patient has access to adequate information, that there is no reasonable alternative, and that the life-ending act is carried out with physician care and with due medical procedures. The Belgian framework mirrors these concerns, and in both countries the safeguards include multiple physicians' assessments, deliberative processes, and the recording and review of cases to monitor for coercion or error. When we look at the text of the law, we sometimes hear a sentence that resembles a careful balancing act between respect for patient autonomy and a duty to protect vulnerable life. The exact words from the statutory material are legal prose meant to standardize a deeply personal choice into a regulated procedure. The patient's voluntary request, the absence of coercion, the unbearable nature of suffering, and the availability of alternatives all must be weighed and documented. In the United States, Oregon's Death with Dignity Act offers another, not identical but parallel, example. Oregon's statute requires that a terminally ill, competent adult person be able to self-administer a lethal medication after making a voluntary request and receiving a physician's confirmation that the person is capable and acting voluntarily, with the illness that will cause death within 6 months, as determined by 2 physicians. The act emphasizes the patient's consent and the physician's role as a facilitator of information and procedural safeguards. In Oregon, the language is explicit about voluntariness and the patient's own choice to die as a clear action that the patient performs. There is a body of court decisions, regulatory standards, and medical guidelines that accompany this law, all designed to prevent coercion and to ensure that the patient's mind remains the site of moral deliberation. Palliative and hospice care offers a contrasting approach, one that seeks to alleviate pain and symptoms while affirming life's value and the patient's dignity without hastening death. Palliative care is built on the premise that comfort, symptom control, and psychosocial support can enable patients to live as fully as possible in their remaining time, even if the illness cannot be cured. Hospice care, a more specialized form focusing on those nearing the end of life, emphasizes patient-centered care, family support, and the belief that dying with dignity involves presence, meaning, and relief from distress. The ethical questions in palliative care are not simply about whether to relieve suffering, but how to do so in ways that respect patient agency while maintaining professional obligations to do no harm, to respect patient autonomy, and to care for the whole person, body, mind, and social world. Two related central issues in this sphere, often treated under the umbrella of withholding and withdrawing life-sustaining treatment, illustrate the nuanced distinctions that matter ethically and legally. Withholding life-sustaining treatment refers to not starting a treatment that could prolong life, such as not initiating dialysis or not placing a respirator in a patient who is dying or whose prognosis is dismal. Withdrawing life-sustaining treatment refers to stopping a treatment that has already begun, such as turning off a ventilator for a patient with irreversible brain injury. The ethical intuition that many patients and clinicians share is that there is a morally important distinction between letting die by not starting a life-sustaining treatment versus actively ending a life by turning off a machine. Yet from some analytic angles, the line can be thinner than it seems, because withholding or withdrawing life support may have the same practical effect as euthanasia in terms of the patient's shortened life. The crucial difference from a moral and narrative standpoint is intention and agency. Withholding is about not imposing a mode of treatment. Withdrawing is about ceasing a treatment that is already in place under the patient's current context and the physician's judgment. The ethical challenge is to determine when either action is morally permissible, when it aligns with the patient's goals of care, and how to communicate these decisions with compassion and transparency to family members and to society. Advanced directives add another layer to this tapestry. They are the patient's own statements about the preferences for care in the event that they become unable to participate in decisions. From a Kantian perspective, advanced directives respect the person's rational planning and autonomous commitments, but the practical risk is that the patient's status may change, their preferences may be misunderstood, or surrogates might misinterpret their wishes. A rights-based approach appreciates the autonomy embedded in directives, but also insists on safeguards to ensure that the patient's previously expressed wishes are honored without being overridden by the fear or uncertainty of medical professionals or family members. The interplay of directives with real-time decisions thus becomes a test of how well a medical system can translate a patient's autonomy into practice under the pressure of illness, pain, and fear. Cultural and legal differences color the ethical map. In some cultural contexts, the duty to care for the patient means continuing aggressive treatment as long as there is any possibility of life extension, while in others, relatives and communities may hold different judgments about burden, relief, and the meaning of a natural end. Legal contexts likewise differ. Some jurisdictions treat euthanasia as a criminal act unless it is regulated by permissive laws. Others permit aid in dying under strict conditions that require multiple physician assessments, waiting periods, and documentation. The religious and philosophical landscape also colors the conversation. Catholic ethical teaching in its traditional form tends toward the prohibition of euthanasia, arguing that life is a gift not to be weaponized against the sanctity of life. Buddhist and Hindu perspectives often emphasize suffering, karma, and the moral weight of intention. Islamic perspectives typically emphasize the sanctity of life and the belief that life and death are ultimately determined by God, with nuanced positions on seeking relief from suffering. The moral conversation thus traverses a wide spectrum of convictions, and that spectrum itself becomes part of the ethical landscape. How do societies respect individual autonomy while honoring shared values about care, vulnerability, and human flourishing? In addition to religious and cultural voices, the modern bioethics conversation, often framed by the four principles approach of Beauchamp and Childress, offers a common language for analysis. Autonomy remains central, but beneficence, non-maleficence, and justice also shape how we debate these questions. Beneficence presses us to act in the patient's best interests, to relieve suffering, and to promote responsible care. Non-maleficence calls the physician to avoid causing harm, including harm that may come from giving or withholding treatment, from misdiagnosis, or from coercive influence. Justice demands attention to how decisions about dying affect marginalized groups, access to palliative care, and the distribution of burdens and benefits across society. In this framework, the ethics of dying is not only about the patient and their doctor. It is about how health systems, families, communities, and policy structures interact to promote or impair human flourishing. Let us enrich this theoretical tour with vivid case vignettes and historical notes, stories that anchor ideas in lived experience, and that illuminate the moral tension between relief, dignity, and the sacredness of life. One vignette takes us to a patient named Elena, who is a 68-year-old with advanced metastatic cancer. Elena has endured years of treatment, the clock of prognosis has slowed to a gradual, uncertain ticking, and pain persists despite strong analgesia. Her nurse speaks softly of a plan to shift fertility of care toward comfort, better symptom control, psychosocial support, and the chance to spend meaningful time with her family. Alina asks if she could end her life on her own terms, if such an option exists, if she could avoid further rounds of chemotherapy that would only prolong suffering, but take away any remaining joy in a single breath. The physician explains the legal boundaries in their jurisdiction, the safeguards, the possibility of palliative sedation if her suffering becomes refractory, and the importance of family discussions and advance directives. Alina's story invites us to ask, is autonomy the sole authority in the decision to die, or is there something more, an invitation to a different kind of life in the face of death, in which relief from pain and the dignity of patient-centered care perhaps yield another kind of end, a dignified closing that remains within the horizon of caregiving. In another vignette, we meet Jin, a 72-year-old man who has lived with a progressive neurodegenerative disease for many years. His quality of life has become severely limited by paralysis, loss of speech, and dependence on others for basic needs. He has an advance directive that specifies his wish not to be kept alive in a state of persistent unconsciousness or severe suffering if cognitive function cannot be preserved. The medical team must consider whether continuing life-sustaining treatment serves the patient's values and whether the patient's current state aligns with his expressed wishes. The ethical questions here move toward non-voluntary decisions in some real-world debates, the risk of surrogate decision-making misalignment with patient values, and the need to protect Jin's dignity while avoiding coercive or careless choices on behalf of someone who cannot speak for themselves. The vignette invites us to think about the nuanced line between respecting advance directives and the ever-changing realities of medical technology, and it underscores how modern lifetimes are often complicated by a patient's evolving possibilities and the family's responsibilities to interpret their loved one's values with humility and care. A further historical anecdote reveals the public drama of assisted dying in the late 20th century. The figure of Dr. Jack Kevorkian emerged in a clash between law, medicine, and public opinion. Kevorkian's outspoken advocacy for patients' right to die and his actions, sometimes controversial, sometimes legally prosecuted, highlight a critical tension. The physician's professional ethic can be pulled between the Hippocratic vow to heal and the patient's right to end unbearable suffering, both of which derive from a conviction about the patient's right to autonomy, dignity, and relief. The Hippocratic Oath, historically phrased as a pledge not to give a deadly drug or to speed the death of a patient, sits in ironic relief against Kevorkian's public demonstrations, showing how medical ethics can shift as social norms, laws, and medical technologies evolve. The oath itself remains a primary source. I will give no deadly drug to anyone if asked, nor will I suggest any such course. The tension between this oath and public demand for relief underscores how medical ethics is a moving target, shaped by social change and new understandings of suffering, autonomy, and care. Another historical note is the development of hospice care in the 20th century, which provides a counterpoint to the immediacy of end-of-life options like euthanasia. The hospice movement, led by figures such as Cicely Saunders, reframed dying as a natural process to be supported with comfort, presence, and meaning, rather than treated as a battlefield to be won or a problem to be solved medically at all costs. Saunders' approach, often summarized in compassionate but precise phrases, captured a vision that has transformed patient care. You matter because you are you, and you matter to the end of your life. This ethos, present in the hospice philosophy and in the global expansion of palliative care, emphasizes that dying is not merely about turning away from life, but about turning toward the deepest needs of the person. Relief from distress, meaningful conversations, reconciliation with loved ones, and a sense that the person's life has been lived with care and attention to their values. It stands as a testament to the possibility of dying with dignity, not by ending life, but by surrounding life with a careful, patient-centered approach that honors the person who is dying. The narrative of the right to die debates in contemporary political philosophy, political policy, and bioethics reveals a cloud-filled sky of positions rather than a single calm horizon. There are social democratic frameworks that treat end-of-life relief as a matter of patient rights and universal access to care, arguing that societies have an obligation to ensure that people can choose death with dignity if they wish, and to provide high-quality palliative care to alleviate suffering in all its forms. There are libertarian currents that emphasize the primacy of individual choice and the right to control one's body and life course without government coercion. There are communitarian concerns that highlight the common good, social trust, and the health of the social fabric, worrying that individual autonomy might undermine obligations to vulnerable populations. And there are religious and sacred secular dialogues that insist on humility before the mystery of life and death, that remind us of limits in medical power, and that call for care that respects life's ultimate meaning while acknowledging the reality of human pain. Cross-references to these broader ideas illuminate how the ethics of death cannot be contained within a single doctrine or a single policy. It lives at the intersection of medicine, law, culture, religion, and personal narrative, and it requires not only rigorous argument but also compassionate imagination. To deepen our discussion, we can take a closer look at how active and passive euthanasia are distinguished in practice, and why this distinction matters for ethical reasoning and policy. Active euthanasia involves a physician or another person actively administering a substance that ends life. Passive euthanasia involves withholding or withdrawing treatment, allowing the patient to die from the underlying illness. In many ethical analyses, the difference in intention matters. The active act intends to terminate life, whereas the passive act intends to respect the patient's wishes and recognize the natural course of the illness while not introducing a direct cause of death. Yet as a practical matter, both paths can lead to the same outcome, a shortened life. This is why many ethicists, clinicians, and policymakers emphasize the importance of clarity about intentions, the consent process, the presence of advance directives, and robust palliative care options that can legitimately replace life-ending actions with relief-focused care. The moral significance, then, lies not only in the act itself but in the broader frame. The environment in which the decision is made, the quality of information provided, the patient's capacity to deliberate, and the safeguards that ensure that autonomy is protected rather than exploited or misunderstood. We should also reflect on the concept of the right to die debates in contemporary political philosophy, where the language of rights, duties, and public policy collides with the realities of medicine and patient care. The right to die is not a universal consensus in ethical theory, and it does not resolve easily into a simple yes or no. It raises core questions about what it means to have a right to something as intimate and consequential as one's own death. Does such a right trump the duty to preserve life? Does it justly apply to every person, regardless of disability, age, or social status? How do we ensure that the right to die is exercised with real autonomy, informed consent, and protections against coercion? The discussions often intersect with broader themes in political philosophy: how we think about the scope and limits of individual freedom, the role of the state in regulating private decisions, and the moral weight of social obligations to protect vulnerable persons. These cross-references to political philosophy, bioethics, medical anthropology, and religious ethics offer depth to the inquiry and remind us that the ethics of death cannot be tethered to a single discipline or a single policy. As we connect theory to practice, let us return to the practical guidance that helps health care professionals navigate end-of-life decisions. Two features deserve emphasis in the clinical arena: communication and shared decision-making. The patient's voice must be heard in a time of pain and fear. The clinician's professional responsibilities must be exercised with humility and care. Shared decision-making, where clinicians and patients discuss goals, risks, benefits, and alternatives, embodies the ethical ideal of autonomy within a framework of beneficence and non-maleficence. It also recognizes the social dimension of a dying person's life. Family members, friends, and caregivers carry emotional weight, moral concerns, and practical burdens. Thus, a nuanced, patient-centered approach emphasizes not simply whether death is permissible, but how care can be ethically choreographed so that the patient's values guide decisions, while ensuring that the patient is not coerced, not exploited, and not left to bear suffering without support. In terms of future technological innovations that might alter this ethical landscape, we may anticipate that advances in lifespan extension, neuroethics, and medical technologies will complicate the conversation even further. If science could radically extend healthy life or restore cognitive function to near-normal levels after severe illness, the calculus around end-of-life decisions would shift. If neurotechnology could one day alleviate conscious suffering in new ways or rescue patients from states of extreme distress without hastening death, we would need to reframe the discussion about relief, autonomy, and the meaning of a life that is still valued by those who inhabit it. The ethical landscape will be shaped by how communities respond to these technologies. Will they be used to expand the horizon of human flourishing, or will they reinforce a fear of suffering so acute that death is seen as a preferable option? The questions are not merely technical, they are deeply human, and the responses will require a synthesis of philosophy, medicine, law, theology, and lived experience. To support this exploration, let us consider two more concrete, real-world prompts for reflection. First, how should societies balance autonomy with protection of the vulnerable? If a patient's voluntary choice to end life is a legitimate exercise of autonomy, How do we ensure that such a choice is not the result of social isolation, economic desperation, poor access to care, or miscommunication about prognosis? Are there safeguards that can be proportionate without becoming coercive? Second, what makes a death dignified across cultures? The term dying with dignity has been used in many policies and campaigns, but its meaning is contested. In some contexts, it is about relief from suffering. In others, it is about maintaining control over one's life narrative and final moments. In still others, it is about aligning with religious or community norms about the sanctity and meaning of life. The cross-cultural and cross-disciplinary nature of these questions invites a collaborative moral imagination. Philosophers, clinicians, policymakers, and family members must listen to one another with humility while preserving spaces for conscience and professional integrity. Now, to provide a few explicit primary-sourced anchors for our discussion. The Hippocratic Oath, in its traditional form, includes a pledge that resonates with our ongoing ethical tension. I will not give a deadly drug to anyone if asked, nor will I advise such a course. This line is frequently invoked as a reminder that medicine has a binding duty to heal and to preserve life, at least on the surface. The Declaration of Geneva, a modern expression of the physician's professional vows, states that the health and well-being of my patient will be my first concern. This document, with its emphasis on patient welfare, has been cited in debates about whether doctors should participate in life-ending practices or in decisions that could hasten death. Kant's imperative, the bedrock of modern deontological ethics, remains a crucial reference point. It speaks not as a policy prescription, but as a moral claim. Treat individuals as ends in themselves, not as means to relieve suffering, nor as instruments of others' ends. The direct quotation, act in such a way that you treat humanity, whether in your own person or in the person of any other, always at the same time as an end and never merely as a means, has resonance in many of these debates, reminding us that the moral weight of decisions about death must always respect the person's inherent worth. On the other side of the ledger, the utilitarian voice often quotes the language of the principle of utility in its pursuit of the greatest happiness. The statement, actions are right in proportion as they tend to promote happiness, is a succinct expression of a philosophical tradition that compels us to consider outcomes, consequences, and overall welfare. When we move to policy discussions, this approach supports the argument that if end-of-life decisions alleviate extreme suffering with proper safeguards, they may be ethically permissible within a framework of social welfare. Yet the ethical landscape quickly reveals the fragility of sole reliance on consequences. The feared slippery slope emerges precisely at the point where the policy success depends on future outcomes, rather than on the moral worth of the patient's individual life. Astor and Saunders in the hospice tradition offer a practical, patient-centered countercurrent to hasty conclusions about death. Cicely Saunders' emphasis on dignity, comfort, and presence, on you matter because you are you, and you matter to the end of your life, stands as a counterweight to any policy that would treat dying solely as a set of mathematical outcomes. The hospice movement has become a global ethic of care that asks us to reframe the dying process not as a medical problem to be solved by ending life, but as a human process to be supported with presence, compassion, and skillful symptom management. Historical anecdotes continue to illuminate ethics in action. The Kevorkian episodes remind us that physician activism can redefine public conscience and alter the moral calculus in real time. They show the tensions between a patient's autonomy, a physician's conscience, and the state's enforcement of law. They remind us that medical ethics is not static. It is a conversation that often intensifies when suffering becomes public and visible. The hospice story reminds us that an alternative moral horizon exists, a practice of dying that centers on the patient's experience, the family's needs, and the physician's commitment to relief within the boundaries of care. These stories help us see that philosophy is not merely about abstract categories, but about the daily, intimate questions people face as life ends. As we bring this exploration toward a close, let us return to the central, practical questions that will shape the coming years. Should autonomy always trump other ethical concerns? What makes a death dignified across cultures? Is relief from suffering always permissible, or are there times when relief requires refraining from ending life because the relationship between relief and the ultimate meaning of life is more complex than a simple calculus of pain and pleasure? In the face of these questions, we must cultivate not only argument and policy, but also empathy, listening, and humility. Our responsibility extends to those who will be living with the consequences of the choices we make today. Patients who yearn for relief from pain, families who carry long memories, clinicians who must balance their professional ethics with the intimate needs of those in their care, and communities who imagine a future in which we treat dying with care, honesty, and respect for life's enduring worth. If you're watching this and you want to engage more deeply, consider these discussion prompts. Should autonomy always trump other ethical concerns, or should there be a built-in presumption in favor of care and life that only yields to death when all other avenues have been exhausted? What precisely constitutes a dignified death across different cultures? How do pain relief, agency, community meaning, and religious or philosophical commitments shape that definition? How do we design institutions that protect vulnerable people from coercion while still honoring a person's right to choose when faced with unbearable suffering? And how might ongoing scientific advances reshape our ethical landscape, lifespan extension, neuroethics, or new forms of symptom relief that blur the boundaries between healing and hastening death? We can also think about the future of policy as a dialogue among many voices: patients, physicians, families, religious communities, legislators, and scholars. What is the proper balance between autonomy and protection? How should advanced directives be designed to be clear, accessible, and robust against misinterpretation? What obligations do societies have to ensure equitable access to high-quality palliative care so that the choice to die is not the only option for those who cannot access relief? How can we calibrate safeguards to preserve trust in medicine while respecting patient self-determination? These questions are not theoretical summer storms. They are practical concerns that shape how people die, how families grieve, and how physicians practice their art in the face of life's end. In closing this segment, let us return to two enduring truths that illuminate this difficult terrain. First, dying well in a modern world requires more than a single prescription or legal rule. It requires a culture of care, a robust palliative framework, honest communication, and systems that honor patient autonomy without erasing the social responsibilities that sustain the vulnerable. Second, the ethics of death demands humility. We cannot pretend to know the perfect policy for every person in every circumstance. We cannot guarantee that every choice will be free from coercion or fear. But we can strive to cultivate the conditions under which a person's final chapter can be chosen with dignity, relief from distress when possible, honest information and support that attends to the person's values, relationships, and longings for meaning. A final reflection in the form of a quote from primary sources to anchor the moral gravity of the questions we have explored. The Hippocratic Oath's stern caution, though often interpreted in modern terms, still resonates with the call to heal and to respect life's sanctity. I will give no deadly drug to anyone if asked, nor will I suggest such a course. The Declaration of Geneva speaks to physician responsibility. The health and well-being of my patient will be my first consideration. And Kant reminds us of the moral law that stands above all practical calculations. Act so that you treat humanity, whether in your own person or in the person of any other, always at the same time as an end and never merely as a means. When these sources speak together across centuries, they do not collapse into one single instruction. They invite us to listen closely to the patient's story, to examine the course of care with honesty, and to hold fast to a principle that respects human life while acknowledging the reality of suffering, the fragility of autonomy, and the profound complexity of ending a life that has, for the person, once mattered deeply. If you have followed this exploration with curiosity and care, you may notice that the questions outnumber the answers, and that the ethical terrain is as much about how we care for each other as about what we decide about death itself. The real-world policies, the stories of patients, and the voices of philosophers all demand our ongoing attention. The conversation is not finished. It only deepens as medicine advances, as cultures exchange their moral intuitions, and as the human face of dying continues to teach those who study ethics about what it means to endure, to choose, to relieve, and to live with a finished life that still claims our respect, our attention, and our care. As you move from this segment to the next, I invite you to carry two things with you: a readiness to listen to diverse voices, even when they break with your own instincts, and an invitation to imagine a practice of death that foregrounds compassion, patient-centered care, and a humility that recognizes the limits of our power while affirming the dignity and worth of every human life. Death is not merely an event in the calendar of a single life. It is a social practice, a choreography of remembrances, a set of rituals that allow a community to breathe again after loss. Welcome to a quiet corner of the world where the last act is not performed in private, but enacted in shared spaces: temples, streets, cemeteries, virtual rooms, homes where photos line the walls, and festivals that turn mourning into a collective matter. In this segment, we will travel across cultures, through memory and ritual, to ask how diverse human communities understand death, how they organize grief, and how memory itself becomes a living force that shapes who we are after someone is gone. We will meet the Day of the Dead, the Aben festival, Tibetan bardo narratives, ancient Egyptian mummification, Viking funeral customs, Victorian mourning etiquette, and contemporary digital memorials. We will pause to listen to the voices of thinkers who have wrestled with these questions: Durkheim, Turner, Aries, Derrida, and Didion. And we will try to listen also to the textures of memory as they appear in art, literature, and film. Most of all, we will listen to our own experiences of loss, our own memories, and the moral psychology that rituals cultivate when sorrow becomes communal practice. We begin with the oldest observation. Death in many societies is not simply an ending. It is a passage that calls the living into a new shared life. The anthropologist Emil Durkheim laid a foundational claim in modern sociology. Religion, in its broad sense, is a unified system of beliefs and practices relative to sacred things, beliefs and practices which unite into one single moral community, a church, a society, a family, all those who adhere to them. If religion is that system, then rites surrounding death are not private matters but social acts that reconstitute the bond among the living. When a person dies, the ritual recalibrates the relationship among strangers and kin, it stabilizes the group's sense of what matters, and it temporarily suspends ordinary divisions to reinforce a shared moral order. The idea of the sacred is not a metaphysical claim here, but a social claim. The objects, the rituals, the symbols, altars, pipes of incense, songs, processions, and the shared meal call everyone back to a common center, a center named by the community rather than by any single individual. Consider the Day of the Dead, Dia de los Muertos, a festival that arrives as autumn settles in Mexico and the southwestern United States. It is not a grim retreat from memory, but a lavish invitation to memory itself. Families prepare altars, ofrendas, adorned with photographs, bright marigolds, candles, pan de muerto, sugar skulls, and the favorite objects of the deceased. They visit cemeteries to decorate graves with fresh flowers, to repaint the stones, to light a path of lanterns so the dead can find their way back. Yet the point is not merely to remember in sorrow, it is to remember in a way that signals continuity. The dead are not erased, they are present, invited to sit at table, to taste the comida that kept them company in life. The ritual thus stitches memory into the fabric of everyday social life. For the children who learn the stories of their grandparents at the foot of a family sepulchre, memory becomes a living agent in identity formation. One sees the self as a thread woven into a larger tapestry of kin, place, and history. The festival makes time circular rather than linear, the living walk with the dead across a bright threshold of color, music, and shared food. Aben, the traditional Japanese festival honoring the spirits of ancestors, similarly grounds memory in movement, in ritual choreography that recognizes the dead as living presences in the present. Lanterns are lit, ancestral home altars are tended, and the family welcomes the ancestral souls back with dances and offerings. The ritual features a paradox. To honor those who are no longer present, communities gather more tightly around the living. People return to ancestral towns, listen to familiar stories, even those told with the same jokes one heard as a child, and perform dances that imprint the body with memory. It is not a denial of death, but a slow, patient recognition that the line between life and memory is porous. The living, through ritual, animate the dead, and by doing so, stabilize the moral economy of the present. Here, memory is a resource for resilience. It counters the isolating force of grief by embedding mourning into communal practice. The Tibetan tradition offers another deep articulation of death as a transitional process. In the Buddhist view, the moment of death is not an end, but a passage, the bardo, the intermediate state between death and rebirth. The rituals surrounding dying and death are meant to guide consciousness through this liminal space toward insight and liberation, or at least toward a less painful rebirth. Lamas may read the signs of the dying, recite mantras, offer instructions about the signs of the bardos, and direct the mind toward familiar narratives of compassion and wisdom. The family and community participate by maintaining calm, by reciting prayers, by creating a space that discourages fear and confusion. The aim is not merely to ease the dying person, but to reframe death as a part of ongoing cycles of being, a matter of continuity across lifetimes rather than a termination. The bardo is a narrative space in which memory of teachers, mentors, cherished mentors acts as a guiding light for those who must navigate the passage. In this sense, memory serves as an ethical map, a way to hold onto moral orientation when the world seems to tilt. Ancient Egypt offers a contrasting and visually spectacular example of ritualized death. Egyptian mummification was not simply an attempt to preserve a body. It was a theology of the afterlife that embedded the individual within a cosmic order. The elaborate process, removal of organs, desiccation with natron, wrapping in linen, the placement of the jar with the heart, the amulets, the elaborate coffin, was all part of a carefully choreographed social and religious economy. The dead were housed within tombs that functioned as micro-societies. Inscriptions, goods, and spells from the Book of the Dead formed a bridge between worlds. The social function here is immediate and tangible. Families invest resources, labor, and time into preserving memory, and in turn, that memory stabilizes the social order by reinforcing the belief in a just, ordered afterlife. The rituals produce a coherent narrative about what life was for and what life is for, even beyond the last breath. The Viking funeral, with its ships and pyres, pushes ritual into a more dramatic and public form. The death was not just the end of an individual, but a public statement about the kinship network's wealth, honor, and social standing. The ship, the funeral pyre, the sacrifice of goods, and sometimes even parts of the family's property, memorialize the fallen while signaling to the cosmos that the community remains intact, that the dead are carried to Valhalla or to their eternal home by the collective esteem of the living. The ritual reaffirms the identity of the group in the world's rough climate. Death is a moment when the living prove their loyalty to the dead and to the values they shared. In Victorian England, mourning comported itself with elaborate social rules and etiquette. Mourning was a social performance, a discipline that regulated not only private sorrow but public comportment. The widow might wear black for a prescribed period, adopt changes in speech, posture, and social life, and navigate a complex system of social expectations about propriety, relocation, and remarriage. The ritual of mourning was a technology of emotional regulation. It constrained outward signs of pain, structured the grief into phases, and crucially, enabled a gradual reintegration of the bereaved into public life. Mourning etiquette thus becomes not a private phenomenon but a public pedagogy in how to grieve in a culture that prizes finitude and propriety. The social life of mourning in this period shows how rituals are used to shape the moral psychology of entire classes and communities, not merely individuals. The rise of digital memorials marks a new phase in the social life of death. Platforms that once housed the living now host curated legacies of the departed. Facebook keeps a memorial room open, preserving posts, photographs, and messages. Twitter and Instagram create digital traces of a life in a stream of momentary posts that accumulate into a memory archive. Virtual reality experiences, holograms, and commemorative websites reconstruct scenes from the deceased's life, enabling distant friends and family to participate in mourning ceremonies that no longer require physical proximity. The questions are not just about technology, they are about what it means to inhabit memory in a networked age. Digital memorials can democratize remembrance, freeing it from the constraints of geography or ritual space, but they can also commodify memory, turning intimate loss into a content stream, into a form of attention. They create new publics of mourning, new spaces for collective reflection, and new expectations for ongoing presence. The memory of the departed becomes a living interface that continues to shape decisions, political stances, and daily routines for the bereaved. This is where the theoretical anchors come into view, not as abstract footnotes but as practical lenses through which to interpret the ritual life around death. Durkheim's claim about religion as a social system helps us see ritual not as a private pastime, but as a mechanism for producing solidarity. The gathered rituals around death, offerings, processions, songs, shared meals, liturgies, and even the silence between words, become acts that bind people into a community that endures beyond the individual life. When a festival commemorates ancestors, or when a family meets to share stories across generations, the social bonds are reaffirmed. The ritual acts like glue, but not glue in a naive sense. It's glue that norms, values, and roles. The customs show who belongs to the community, what the community claims as sacred, and what obligations the living owe to the dead and to the living again after loss. In Durkheim's vocabulary, ritual furnishes collective effervescence, the energy of the group that surges through ritual action, reanimating the sense of being part of something larger than oneself. The ritual in this sense works as a social technology for resilience. It transforms private pain into a shared memory that sustains the moral life of the community. Victor Turner's contribution is to illuminate the structure of these rituals as rites of passage, separation, liminality, and incorporation. In the context of death, dying itself is a liminal state, and the various rituals function as a passage that moves the bereaved from an old social status, the status of the person who shared life with the departed, to a new one, the status of the bereaved member of the community who carries forward memory and responsibility. The liminal phase is often marked by ambiguity. Grief may be a private storm, but the ritual scaffolds that storm into a process that the community can survive with. The separation stage might involve the removal of the dying person from ordinary social ties. The liminal stage could be the mourning period and the rituals that punctuate it, and the incorporation might be the moment when the bereaved re-enters social life, but with a changed identity. Turner's insight helps us understand why rituals are not merely symbolic, they reorganize the social self. They create spaces in which the meaning of life, death, and memory can be renegotiated in the presence of loss. Philosophical depth enters most palpably through Philippe Ariès, who argued that the Western history of death is a history of changing attitudes toward death and dying. He traced a shift from medieval, intimate, communal handling of death to a modern, privatized, sanitized, and medicalized experience. In the Middle Ages, death occurred in the midst of life. It was a social event, a shared drama. In late modernity, death is hidden away, bedsides replaced by hospital wards, corpses removed from the household, and mourning conducted more by the professionals than by the family. Ariès' thesis has been contested, but it remains a provocation. It invites us to ask what is gained and what is lost when death becomes a private matter, when museums of memory replace public rituals, when the dying body becomes a patient rather than a participant in communal ritual. The contemporary moment, where social media memorials and crisis rites proliferate, asks, is memory simply privatized pain, or can it be redescribed through new social rituals that still bind communities? Derrida's ethics of mourning pushes us toward a different horizon. Mourning as a work that does not end, a process of ethical obligation to the one who is gone and to the living who must navigate the absence. The work of mourning is, in Derridian terms, an invitation to attend to what cannot be completely captured by language. Mourning is a project that refuses to yield to closure. It demands ongoing responsibility, a night and day attention to the absence that memory imposes. The ethics here is not simply a private sentiment, but a public responsibility, a trust placed in the exercise of memory to keep the dead within the moral circle of the living. The work is not about reconstructing a pristine past, but about negotiating with absence, about continuing to speak the names of the departed, and about allowing memory to shape present action. The consequence for ritual is clear. Rituals must leave room for the incompleteness of mourning, for the long tail of grief that resists tidy endings, for the fact that memory keeps changing as new events, new losses, and new communities emerge. If we turn to Didion, memory becomes a test of moral realism. In the Year of Magical Thinking, Didion writes with a quiet, almost clinical clarity about how life changes in an instant and how memory functions in the wake of that change. She captures the paradox of memory. It is both intimate and unreliable, a source of meaning and a site of haunting. Her most famous line, "Life changes fast. Life changes in the instant," suddenly reappears as a reminder that memory, while invaluable, is never perfectly faithful to what occurred. Memory becomes a discipline, a way of knitting together the past and present so that the living can continue. This is not sentimentality, it is a form of moral gravity. Memory in her account is a practice of attention, a daily work of choosing what to remember, what to tell, and what to keep to oneself. In Didion's sense, memory bridges personal identity with familial and cultural memory. It names who we have been, who we are, and who we owe to those we have lost. The cross-references to Stoic practices of mortality and to Hindu and Buddhist ideas of rebirth and liberation widen our horizon. The Stoics offer a disciplined approach. Memento mori, remember that you will die, serves as a moral constraint that helps direct our choices. Seneca, Marcus Aurelius, and Epicurus encourage a daily practice of reflection on the fragility of life, not as fear, but as clarity. What would be worthy of a life if its end came tomorrow? The ethical payoff is resilience, courage under the knowledge that life is finite. The ritual life of death then becomes a classroom for moral psychology. It instructs individuals and communities in what matters when time is limited. Hindu and Buddhist traditions add another dimension by presenting death as part of a larger cycle: rebirth, moksha, nirvana. In these frameworks, memory is not a final anchor but a provisional waypoint along a longer journey. Death becomes part of a cosmos of becoming, a passage toward liberation or renewed existence. The idea that death is not the last word but a transition invites rituals that train the mind to let go, to release attachments, and to orient toward compassion. Across these diverse traditions, there are two core ideas to keep in view. First, ritual functions to shape memory and communal identity after death. The function of ritual is both personal and collective. It helps individuals cope with grief while reinforcing shared values, shared stories, and a sense of belonging. Ritual teaches the bereaved how to remember in ways that are morally coherent with their community's identity. It offers a shared grammar for mourning, a language of symbols that translates private pain into social memory. The second idea is that memory, when integrated into ritual, becomes a living resource for the living. Memory molds who we become after a loss. It anchors us to a lineage of values, stories, and obligations. In the case of Dia de los Muertos, memory becomes a practical continuity. The living remember through offerings, through the telling of stories, through the photographs that line the altar. In Tibetan practices, memory becomes a navigational tool for the spirit in transit, guiding through a dangerous passage toward a safer rebirth or enlightened state. In Viking and Egyptian ritual, memory anchors a social order by honoring the dead as guardians of kinship, wealth, and cosmic order. Two examples best illuminate the breadth of these patterns. First, the Dia de los Muertos festival foregrounds remembrance as a joyful, practical practice of continuity. The dead live in these rituals not by erasing their absence, but by bringing them into the present through color, laughter, shared food, and the repetition of family stories. The ofrendas are not static monuments, they are active sites of memory, recharging the social bond between generations. The ritual invites the living to talk to the dead as if distance were trivial, as if the voices of ancestors could still respond. It treats memory as a social technology that creates meaning in the present, a memory that makes sense of the past not as a closed archive, but as a living conversation that includes those who came before and those who come after. Second, the Tibetan Bardo narrative offers a radically different mechanism for memory and transition. The guidance of lamas, the recitation of mantras, and the careful narration of death as a passage through states of mind reframes memory as a mentor that accompanies the dying process. The memory of teachers and spiritual lineage acts as a guide through fear, confusion, and the unknown. The sage's memory becomes a map for the dying consciousness, a way to maintain moral orientation in the face of impermanence. The ritual here is not merely about coping with loss, but about shaping the very trajectory of the next life, a memory that becomes a force for wisdom across cycles of being. We can also draw upon Victorian mourning etiquette as a laboratory for social psychology. The elaborate, codified practices of mourning were not merely about sentimentality. They were a system for regulating grief in the public sphere, providing a structure within which individuals could process loss and families could negotiate social roles after death. The rituals gave mourners a script for how to express sorrow without destabilizing social life. They offered a way to negotiate identity after the death of a husband or a wife in a culture that expected dignity and composure. The social function here is clear, a standardized set of behaviors that preserves social order and preserves a sense of continuity in families and communities, even as individual losses create ruptures. The modern rise of digital memorials adds another layer to the discussion. On social networks, memorialized profiles become virtual shrines, storied spaces where friends can leave messages, images, and memories that may outlive a physical space. These digital spaces are not merely replacements for the grave, they extend the social life of memory into the everyday digital rhythm of life. They alter how memory is curated, who can participate, and how long memory persists. They can democratize memory by enabling a broader circle of friends and relatives to contribute. They can also commercialize memory by monetizing visibility, curating nostalgia as content. And they raise questions about consent, privacy, and the ongoing claim of the dead upon the living. If memory becomes a digital artifact, then rituals must adapt. Where is the boundary between ongoing memory and commodified spectacle? How does digital memorialization shape moral psychology? How do it changes the way we grieve and how we imagine the future? In a broader philosophical frame, we must consider the ethical and epistemic dimensions of memory in the wake of death. Derrida's concept of the ethics of mourning challenges us to see memory as a task without final closure. The work of mourning insists that we do not erase the person who is gone. We must keep their memory present, even as we transform our own lives around the void they left. The dead do not simply vanish in memory. They exert a continuous, if subtle, influence on our choices and our responsibilities. The practice of mourning, whether through tears or through ritual or through acts of remembrance in daily life, becomes an obligation to the truth of our relationships. If memory educates us to live more fully, then rituals connecting to memory become moral laboratories. They test our hesitations, our fears, our tendency toward avoidance, and our capacity for care. The cross-references to Hindu and Buddhist traditions remind us that memory, death, and rebirth intersect in powerful ways. In these traditions, there is a belief in cycles, death and rebirth, karma and liberation, that reframe the meaning of memory. The idea that all compounded things are impermanent invites an acceptance that memory, too, is subject to change. But this does not render memory meaningless. It invites fidelity to a larger project of liberation and compassionate action. Rituals in these contexts train the mind to endure change with equanimity, to hold memory lightly enough to prevent it from becoming bitterness or obsession, yet deeply enough to preserve guidance for moral living. Memory, in this sense, becomes an instrument of spiritual formation as well as a social practice. To push our analysis further, we should examine art and literature, which have long reframed death, memory, and mourning. In poetry, Emily Dickinson's "Because I Could Not Stop for Death" embodies a companionable, patient encounter with mortality. Death is personified as a carriage driver who accompanies the speaker on a ride through life's landscapes, fields of grain, the setting sun, until the moment of burial and the final stillness. The poem places death within the rhythm of everyday life and transforms the encounter into a quiet meditation on what endures after a life is spent. The poem's insistence on memory and memory's afterlife is, in itself, an argument for the cultural persistence of the dead through the language of art. In cinema, The Seventh Seal directs us to the medieval imagination of death as a constant interlocutor. The knight's game of chess with death becomes a meditation on fear, meaning, and the possibility of transcending mortality through art, faith, or solidarity. The film asks whether culture can resist the annihilating force of death through reason, ritual, and communal solidarity. If ritual is the language by which a people talk about their fear of oblivion, then cinema becomes a modern amphitheater where that language is tested in the crucible of representation. Coco, the animated film inspired by Dia de los Muertos, translates the festival into a child-friendly narrative about memory, family obligation, and the power of storytelling. The film shows how memory, when animated by affection, can cross the boundaries of life and death and create a bridge between generations that is both comforting and morally instructive. In both cases, art and film function as memory machines, helping societies negotiate loss by offering symbolic resources that make death legible. Let us now turn to an analytic synthesis. What do rituals around death reveal about what communities value after death? The answer lies in the ways these rituals manage fear, support coping, shape personal and collective identities, and facilitate social continuity. The function of ritual appears in two primary forms. First, ritual provides a structured, predictable, and meaningful framework within which individuals can experience grief. It creates a safe space for emotion to unfold. A set stage upon which tears can be shed, stories can be told, and bonds can be reaffirmed. Second, ritual encodes a set of shared values, stories, and obligations that ensure social continuity. The dreams that the living hold about the future, how to educate the young, how to care for the elderly, how to honor the dead, how to build communities that can withstand the storms of loss, are rehearsed and reaffirmed in ritual. Memory operates in parallel as both a personal and social phenomenon. Personal memory gives individuals a way to endure loss by selectively preserving meaningful contingencies, the faces, the meals, the jokes, the moral teachings of the deceased. Social memory, conversely, preserves a common moral memory, the stories passed down, the rituals codified, the symbols shared across generations. In combination, ritual and memory form a stable axis around which communities orient their moral energies. They help people answer recurring questions. What do we value when someone dies? What do we owe to those who have come before? What do we owe to those who will come after? How shall we live with the memory of the dead in the present day? The why of ritual is inseparable from the how of memory. Two guiding questions structure this inquiry. How do rituals shape our experience of grief, and what do memory and memorials reveal about our values after death? On the first question, ritual shapes grief by converting raw, unstructured pain into a sequence of meaningful experiences. Grief becomes a narrative arc, punctuated by ceremonial moments, sharing stories, lighting candles, singing hymns, or visiting a grave, that provide the bereaved with a language for sorrow. In this sense, rituals function as a form of moral psychology. They help the bereaved reorganize their emotional life and their sense of agency after loss. They can also reframe the social role of the bereaved. A widow or widower can be recognized not only as someone who suffered loss, but as someone who bears the memory of the deceased into the world, and who has an obligation to the living to continue the life that the deceased valued. On the second question, memory and memorials reveal what communities value most. The emergence of certain rituals highlights the moral commitments of a culture: family continuity, reverence for ancestors, the sacredness of the body, the legitimacy of memory, and the responsibilities of the living to one another. In Dia de los Muertos, memory underscores family continuity, intergenerational dialogue, and the idea that the dead remain with us as voices and stories that shape the family's present. In Tibetan practice, memory becomes an ethical map guiding the dying towards spiritual outcomes. In ancient Egypt, memory is a cosmological undertaking that ties the individual to the cosmic order. In Viking ritual, memory is a political act, a statement of kinship, strength, and social cohesion. In Victorian mourning etiquette, memory is a social technology, a regulated set of behaviors that stabilizes public life in the face of private sorrow. Digital memorials, in contrast, reveal a modern longing to keep memory accessible, interactive, and public, while also introducing questions about the commodification of memory, the ethics of online presence, and the nature of communal belonging in a networked world. Let me turn now to close readings of specific artifacts, poems, films, and rituals that illuminate the themes we've traced. In Emily Dickinson's Because I Could Not Stop for Death, memory and mortality braid together with a calm acceptance that is almost musical. Death, as a courteous carriage driver, invites the speaker to ride through scenes of life that memory can revisit at will. The ride is not a grim march toward oblivion, it is a measured tour through the landscapes of memory and time. The carriage's slow pace implies that memory, far from being hurried away by death, remains as a companion that travels alongside the dying. The poem ends with a quiet, almost domestic finality. The speaker's memory of her life continues in the presence of death, not as a jolt of fear, but as a sustained, patient remembrance. The moral psychology of the poem is a pedagogy of patience and faith in memory as a sustaining force. In Ingmar Bergman's The Seventh Seal, death is a character with a philosophical presence, a dark interlocutor who asks not for fear, but for a reckoning about what life means in the face of mortality. The knight's struggle to find meaning in the face of death is a meditation on how ritual, art, and community can offer a counterweight to the terror of annihilation. The dance of death becomes a trope for the moral and existential task of human life. To create a life of significance insofar as it could outlast the usurpation of time. The ritual of seeking meaning in mortality is, for Bergman, a ritual of conscience, an invitation to examine our commitments, our loves, and our obligations to others. In Coco, the Pixar film, Dia de los Muertos is transposed into a child-friendly narrative about memory, family, and the power of storytelling. The film makes a startling claim that memory is not merely a private interior state but a social practice that binds generations. When Miguel visits the land of the dead, the rituals of memory become a literal map of belonging. The grandmother's insistence on telling stories to keep ancestors alive reveals a basic principle. Memory is an act of moral care, not a passive recollection. The film invites viewers to realize that memory can be a bridge across the generations, a way to keep the dead present in the everyday life of the living. It demonstrates how modern media can recast ritual in a global culture, allowing a diverse audience to participate in a ritual that once traveled only within family and local tradition. Let us also reflect on the ars moriendi, the medieval art of dying, as an anecdote about how a culture teaches its members to die well. The ars moriendi was a didactic literature of medieval Christian Europe that described the moral and spiritual struggles of dying souls, offering counsel and strategies for confronting temptation, fear, and sin at the hour of death. It presented death not as a private catastrophe, but as a moral test in which the dying person could exercise virtue, humility, repentance, faith, and reconciliation with God and neighbor. The ars moriendi thus quietly reframed death as a moral education, a pedagogy that cultivated the capacity to face finitude with courage and hope. The shift toward teachable dying, toward a process by which the dying could guide their own souls to a favorable outcome, reoriented the dying person from a passive victim of fate to an active agent in the moral life of the entire community. The modern funeral industry offers another instructive anecdote about the commercialization of death in the West. The professionalization of death, the rise of funeral homes, embalming, caskets, death care as a service industry, reflects a transformation of ritual into market exchange. The funerary industry, by professionalizing and standardizing death, has made it possible for individuals and families to experience a certain predictability and control over the process of dying and memorialization. At the same time, the commodification raises questions. To what extent does market logic shape the meaning of memory? How do price, convenience, and aesthetic choices influence the moral significance of the farewell? The dialogue between industry and ritual is not a mere critique of capitalism. It is a probe into how societies negotiate fear, vulnerability, and the desire for dignity at the end of life. It invites us to examine how rituals can be preserved, adapted, or reimagined in ways that maintain authenticity and meaning without becoming mere products. Cross-referencing further, we encounter a cluster of ideas that enrich our understanding. The Stoics' insistence on contemplating mortality is not simply a Stoic trick to discipline fear, it is a practical invitation to live more fully. The practice of memento mori, a reminder of mortality, can lead to a sharpened perception of values, a desire to live justly, and a commitment to acts of care. Hindu and Buddhist conceptions of rebirth and liberation likewise reframe memory and death as part of a larger spiritual itinerary. The idea of moksha or nirvana anchors the ethics of life and death in the aim of liberation from suffering, a release that memory can help illuminate if memory is channeled toward compassion, wisdom, and non-attachment. In sum, a cross-cultural reading of death rituals reveals patterns that are both persistent and adaptive. The function of ritual is to shape communal memory and individual coping in ways that sustain moral psychology and social order. Memory, far from being a sterile repository of facts, appears as the engine that animates identity after death. Memorials, whether physical, ritual, or digital, are not static monuments but dynamic sites of meaning where the living negotiate what they value and what they owe to the dead. The rituals of death across time and space reveal a shared human project, to live with and through the memory of the dead, to honor those who crafted the lineages we inherit, and to use memory as a moral compass that guides our actions in the present. Before we conclude, a final reflection. The modern world is full of friction between old rituals and new technologies. Digital memorials offer unprecedented reach and immediacy, but they challenge the boundaries of what counts as a memorial space, how it is curated, and who has a voice in shaping memory. The question becomes not merely how to memorialize, but how to memorialize well, how to honor the dead while preserving the integrity of memory, how to balance communal sharing with individual privacy, and how to ensure that memory remains a force for moral clarity rather than a passive script on a screen. The answer lies in a sensitive, ongoing conversation between tradition and innovation, between the time-tested wisdom of ritual and the liberating possibilities of new media. Rituals will adapt, memory will persist. The moral psychology of grief, its capacity to shape compassion, responsibility, and communal solidarity, will endure if we attend to memory as both a personal ache and a public trust. In closing, consider the simple question that threads through all these reflections. What do we value after death? What do we hope the living will remember about us, about the communities we belong to, about the values we purported to uphold? The rituals we practice and the memories we cultivate answer this question not by pretending death is nothing, but by insisting that life must be meaningful in relation to others. Rituals teach the living to grieve with care, to remember with honesty, and to act with a sense of moral responsibility that reaches beyond the moment of loss. Memory, in turn, teaches the living to imagine a future in which the dead continue to be present in the fabric of everyday life, not as mere ghosts of the past, but as guiding voices in the making of meaning. There is a quiet poetry to all of this. The dead do not vanish when memory remains. Memory is the bridge between lives, the thread that binds the living to the dead, the way a culture says with quiet insistence that what we did together matters, that who we were for one another continues to shape what we will become. Rituals of death, memory, and memorials are not antiquarian curiosities, but living practices that keep communities whole in the face of loss. They teach us how to grieve, how to honor, and how to move forward with tenderness, courage, and responsibility. If we listen closely to the stories of Dia de los Muertos, Aben, Tibetan Bardo, the mummies of ancient Egypt, the seafaring dead of the Norse saga, the somber etiquette of Victorian drawing rooms, and the new voices of digital memorials, we hear a chorus that transcends time and place. Death is universal, memory is vital, and the rituals we create are the moral architecture of communal life. And perhaps in the quiet, there is a final thought to carry with us into tomorrow. If ritual anchors memory and memory informs identity, then the question we might return to is this: how will the memory you cultivate today shape the life you live tomorrow? What stories will you tell about the dead that will help the living endure? And what forms of remembrance will you champion that might guide future generations toward greater compassion, wisdom, and shared humanity? In the Snooze philosophy spirit, the aim is not to conquer grief with bright bravado, but to cultivate a reflective, patient companionship with loss. To walk gently through the field of memory, noticing how the flowers of remembrance bloom in unexpected places, and how the social life of death, ritual, memory, and memorial continues to teach us what it means to be human together. Close your eyes for a moment and listen to the quiet that follows a question we seldom push to the edge of the mind. What makes you, you, as time moves forward and days accumulate like quiet sediment in a lake? If a perfect replica stood in your place, behaving just as you would, feeling your feelings, remembering your memories, would that replica be you? Or would you remain, in some essential sense, the same person who woke up this morning, who felt joy in a sunrise, who braced against grief, and who will someday face the silence of the final curtain? The question of personal identity across time, how we persist through change, what it would take to count as the same self from yesterday to today, and whether we can coherently talk about an afterlife without preserving the same individual, sits at the boundary of philosophy, psychology, theology, and even practical life. It threads through the way we tell our own stories, the way medical care plans for deteriorating minds, and the way cultures imagine what remains after death. Let us begin by tracing the origins of this inquiry, not merely as a scholastic problem, but as a lived concern. The ancient and classical traditions long wrestled with what it means to endure. In Plato's dialogues, the soul is a seat of reasoning and virtue, a form that survives the body's decay with an arguably immortal character. The Phaedo told as Socrates faces the moment of death, paints a mood of patient assent, death as release rather than rupture, a continuation of inquiry that outlasts the body's distractions. Socrates, in that posture, reframes identity not as a stubborn line of continuous matter, but as a continuity of a rational life animated by the soul's search for truth. He suggests that the self is not simply a bundle of physical qualities, but the life of the mind, an argument that invites us to imagine identity as something that could, in an appropriate framework, survive bodily demise if the core of inquiry remains intact. Across the centuries, English empiricism reshaped the terrain. John Locke, seeing personal identity through the lens of consciousness and memory, proposed that what makes a person the same through time is not the sameness of substance in the body, but the sameness of consciousness, specifically, the memory one can retain of one's past actions and experiences. Locke's key claim can feel almost quiet to the modern ear, but it matters profoundly. If a person can remember doing something in childhood, and later remembers that memory, then, for Locke, that remembering agent, this continuity of conscious experience, constitutes the same person across the gap of years. The memory place for Locke becomes the anchor of identity. In his view, consciousness weaves a thread that ties the older and younger person together, albeit by a very particular standard. Memory and the capacity to reflect upon one's own thoughts, acts, and experiences as one's own. David Hume challenges the very solidity of that thread. If memory is a necessary condition for identity, what remains when memory falters or extends into a clouded, shifting pattern? Hume dissolves the idea of a persistent self into something more like a bundle of perceptions, sensations, impressions, memories, beliefs that come and go. He famously warned that when we try to examine the self, we encounter only fleeting perceptions, never a fixed, continuous entity lurking behind them. I never can observe anything but the perceptions, he writes, and then he adds the famous but disputed line that the mind is a bundle of perceptions. In that bundle, no singular core floats serenely, but rather a fluxing set of experiences that hold together by habit, association, and expectation. Identity in this line of thought is not a stubborn atom but a constellation, an arrangement that we call the self only because we organize and narrate it as a unity. In the 20th century, the texture of the debate grows denser with the work of Derek Parfit, whose thought experiments are almost cinematic in their capacity to unsettle first-order intuitions. Parfit argues against the primacy of numerical sameness, the same person, as a strict identity across time, as what matters for survival. Instead, what matters are psychological continuity and connectedness. The continuities and connections of memories, intentions, character, and personality that link the past to the present. He provocatively writes that identity itself is not what matters for the moral life. Rather, it is the preservation of that web of psychological relation that matters. If a brain were transplanted, or if a person could be teleported by duplicating neural states with perfect fidelity, Parfit asks us to consider whether the survivor would be the same person as the original, or a continuation of a pattern of mental life that would deserve the name of the same self. In his memorable formulation, identity is not what matters, he defers to the significance of psychological continuity and connectedness as the critical condition for survival, even when the numerical identity of the person might be in question. In the same period, Thomas Nagel offered a sharp commentary on death and value that invites a different kind of reflection about identity. Death, Nagel argues, is a radical interruption in the life of a person. It deprives the living of future experiences, projects, and goods they would otherwise come to enjoy. The personal horror of death, for Nagel, arises not simply from the fact of cessation, but from the imagination of what would have been had one continued to live. Death is a serious thing, in a way that cannot be fully captured by talk of a soul leaving a container or a body simply ceasing to function. It is a violation of the continuity of a life that would have endured had it not been cut off. The result is a tension. On the one hand, there are robust accounts of selfhood that can outlive the body in various hypothetical ways. On the other, death makes a case for recognizing the fragility and fragility's moral and existential weights. The contemporary scene adds further texture with physicalist and functionalist perspectives. A physicalist might insist that personal identity tracks the actual physical structure of the brain and body, the material substratum that supports mental life. A functionalist would argue that identical inputs, outputs, and causal roles matter most. If two systems play the same functional role, they count as the same mind in a meaningful sense, even if their substrate is different. In this framework, memory and psychological continuity become manifestations of a deeper structural and functional story. What matters is not the exact material continuity, but the preservation of systems of information processing, causal connections, and coordinated behavior. These views challenge the older memory-centric conception. They also invite the possibility that radical life extension, brain augmentation, or sophisticated neural interfaces could produce enduring subjects with real continuity, even if the exact original neurons are replaced over time. The question then becomes not just whether the same brain persists, but whether the shape of the mind's architecture persists in a way that preserves the life's narrative arc. And yet no account of identity seems adequate without a seat at the table of non-self traditions. The Buddhist notion of anatta, or non-self, occupies a starkly different vantage point. The Buddhist tradition warns against clinging to a fixed self as a central truth. It teaches that all phenomena are impermanent and interdependent, and that what we call the self is a convenient construction arising from impermanent processes, a stream of mental and physical states that are always in flux. The phrase sabsankara anicca in Pali, often translated as all conditioned things are impermanent, is not merely a metaphysical claim but a practical admonition. Attachment to a fixed self distorts perception and fosters suffering. In this view, the puzzle of identity across time dissolves into a more radical understanding of selfhood as process rather than substance. If there is continuity, it is not the persistence of a single, unchanging core, but the continuity of patterns, dispositions, and interdependent relations that integrate experience across time. The self is not a vessel that persists through death. It is a pattern of processes that may or may not be separable from the realm of awareness and action. Historically, the debate has not only unfolded in the salons of philosophy, but also in the crucibles of life and death. The ship of Theseus, first entertaining a rustic puzzle in Plutarch's pages, dramatizes the question with a practical, almost cinematic vividness. If every plank of a ship is replaced, does it remain the same ship? If we replace the brain's cells a few at a time, is the mind still the same? If a body were gradually replaced, or if a brain were moved to a different body and maintained its memories, would that person persist, or would another? The ship is a parable about identity's stubbornness in the face of change. The ancient thought experiment sits alongside the modern memory tests and the brain replacement scenarios used in thought experiments about teleportation and duplication. It invites us to press against the intuitive pull toward a singular, indivisible self, and instead to ask what a person's identity consists of. Is it a fixed essence, or a story that keeps telling itself through time? Two historical anecdotes anchor the exploration in a human register. The first is Socrates on the soul and the virtue of death. In the Phaedo, Socrates faces the moment when the body dies, and the philosopher, in a serene frame, argues that the death of the body is a liberation for the soul, enabling it to turn toward more refined forms of knowledge. The death, rather than a tragedy, becomes a step in the pilgrimage of inquiry. The second anecdote arises from the 19th and 20th centuries' philosophical and psychological debates about identity. In this era, thinkers wrestled with the reality of the self in an age of scientific psychology, with figures like William James describing the self as a stream of consciousness and other scholars debating whether there is a stable center that endures. The shift from a single, enduring self to a more dynamic, perhaps fragmented, sense of self reflects a larger turn toward seeing human experience as continuous change, rather than as the continuity of a singular essence. Placed side by side, Socrates' calm acceptance of death and the modern psychologist's insistence on the fluidity of the self reveal not a single road, but a landscape of possible narratives about who we are. To weave these strands together, we must examine how memory theory and bodily continuity stand in relation to each other. Memory, in its strongest form, looks like a bridge across time. It connects acts and experiences and assigns ownership to a self that persists through recall. But this memory bridge faces challenges. What happens when memory is damaged, when amnesia erases chapters of one's life, or when a person's autobiographical memory becomes unreliable? In such cases, does the person lose their identity, or is identity resiliently reconstituted by other features, character, disposition, and continuing mental life, despite gaps in memory? Parfit's insistence on psychological continuity does not erase the possibility that memory is a cornerstone. It asks us to consider the broader network that sustains personhood. We are not merely the sum of discrete memories. We are the arrangement of preferences, goals, and dispositions that organize our memory into a coherent plan of life. But the body offers a different kind of continuity, bodily continuity that follows the gradual maintenance of the organism's functioning, a chain of physiological processes that binds present to past through the physical substrate that houses the mind. Think of tissues being renewed, cells dying and being replaced, the nervous system maintaining a pattern of connectivity that can support the same life, even as its atoms diminish or are replaced. The practical implications of these theoretical lines are demanding and intimate. Consider long-term memory loss, such as what occurs in some forms of dementia. When a person's memory fades, their narrative self-frays. The therapist's or caregiver's sense of the patient's identity shifts as memories fade. Yet families often report that the person remains the same in moral and emotional registers, the same sense of humor, the same loves and fears, the same patterns of care for others, even when the autobiographical memory that once anchored a consistent sense of self no longer does. This tension cries out for a more robust conception of identity than memory alone can offer. If we insist that the self is identical with the content of memory, we risk dissolving a person into a sequence of erasures and recollections. If instead we broaden identity to include character, dispositions, relational history, and a sense of continuity in motives and concerns, we preserve a living sense of personhood even when memory is compromised. And if the body's continuity counts, we might expect that the person's identity could persist through radical cognitive enhancement or even substitution of the brain, as long as the functional repertoire, the capacities that define personhood in the relevant contexts, remains intact. For those who imagine an afterlife, the question of personal identity takes on an especially dramatic hue. Can there be a coherent framework for identity beyond death without preserving the same person in any literal sense? Different traditions offer distinct answers. Some religious and metaphysical accounts maintain a personal soul that endures beyond the body, perhaps resulting in a continuity of personal memory and recognition in a different plane of existence. However, even within this space, questions arise. Does the postmortal self retain the same memories, moral development, and relational complexity, or is memory reconstituted in a transformed form? The Parfitian critique can be deployed here as well. If the afterlife is defined by a form of persistence in a disembodied state, what exactly is preserved? Is it the psychological life of the person, with stable dispositions and preferences carried into a new mode of existence? Or is it a different, perhaps more minimal identity that survives due to divine or cosmic scaffolding that guarantees continuity without requiring numerical sameness? In contrast, the Buddhist line of thought raises a counterintuitive possibility. If there is no fixed self to carry across death, if the self is a process rather than an essence, then the afterlife, in the sense of literal personal persistence, might be replaced by a continuity of karma, of causal patterns and rebirth in a new stream of contingent experiences. The doctrine of anatta challenges the very premise of a durable personal identity in the same way that memory theory might be challenged by a plausible narrative of a mind that persists while its substrate changes, or by a teletransportation that yields a successor with the same desires but a different experiential history. The Buddhist view invites us to reflect on the kind of continuity that counts as survival, and whether the idea of personal survival should be reinterpreted as a continuity of ethical life and meaningful relational patterns rather than a stubborn sameness. This is not merely an academic exercise. It bears on how we plan for the future, how we engage with the elderly whose memory fades, how we take responsibility for consequences that will be felt long after our present self has dissolved into memory and neurons. To ground the discussion in direct, lived examples, let us turn to two practical illustrations. The first is long-term memory loss, the gradual erosion of autobiographical memory that robs a person of a clear sense of who they have been. In such cases, the patient may continue to function, yet the story that makes the person distinct, the thread that ties a lifetime of experiences into a coherent narrative, begins to detach. The caregiver learns to speak with the patient not only about what is remembered, but about what remains meaningful, about values that persist even when the past is partially inaccessible. The second example concerns the future self and the role of identity in decision-making. When we make promises to our future selves, we implicitly rely on a stable sense of continuity, that the future I will be the same person who makes that promise, or at least that the narrative arc will permit the promise to be kept by someone who cares as we care about the consequences now. Procrastination becomes not a mere lapse but an ethical question. If the future self is not guaranteed to be the same, why should the present self defer a costly, morally significant action? If Parfit is right that what matters is the continuity of psychological connection rather than numerical identity, we may still act with responsibility toward the future person who will inhabit the long arc of life, because the continued pattern of values and reasonableness matters as much as a single, unchanging essence. Yet counterarguments intrude with force. One counterargument arises from the intuitive and deeply social sense of unity of consciousness. There is a powerful pull in the everyday experience of living, that we are the same person from one minute to the next, that a stream of consciousness carries a center that remains recognizable, even across minor changes in mood or circumstance. The unity of first-person experience, or what it feels like to be the same subject who notices a change in taste or in memory, can be so compelling that it seems to demand a real, substantial persistence across time. Even if a memory-based or functionalist account can describe how a person could continue to exist under certain transformations, the felt unity of conscious experience resists dismissal. The challenge is to articulate precisely what this unity amounts to, and whether the unity suffices to guarantee the kind of persistence we think we observe in ordinary life. Another strong counterargument is the possibility that beliefs about an afterlife might offer a coherent framework for identity persistence beyond death. If one accepts the premise that there exists an enduring spiritual or non-material core that can endure beyond physical demise, then the question of continuity changes direction. Afterlife hypotheses often entail a form of reconstitution of the person in another mode of existence, perhaps preserving memory and personality in an altered relational structure. If this is possible, does it require a strict numerical sameness, or can a meaningful, tender form of continuity be achieved through a different ontological arrangement? These debates are not mere curiosities. They influence how communities grieve, how the living relate to the dead, and how cultures imagine justice and reward or punishment after life ends. The tension between continuity as a feature of memory and psychology and continuity as a feature of a spiritual or metaphysical status creates space for a pluralistic approach to identity. To illuminate the discussion further, we can weave in cross-references to broader ideas and thinkers. Parfit's emphasis on future-oriented ethics, on the moral importance of potential future persons, intersects with debates about whether we owe obligations to those who do not yet exist and who will be affected by our actions today. Parfit's framework makes us aware that the future self is not a mere ghostly extension of the present, but a crucial participant in moral life. Stoic and Buddhist conceptions of selfhood, by contrast, invite a more radical reconsideration of what counts as a self and what counts as intact agency. The Stoics, with their emphasis on rational alignment with nature, propose a form of continuity grounded in virtue rather than in the particular content of thoughts. The Buddhist teaching of non-attachment to a fixed self reframes personal identity as a dynamic and interdependent process rather than as a solitary anchor. These cross-references encourage us to see identity as a family of possibilities rather than a single, monolithic entity. Let us also be honest about the implications of different frameworks for science, policy, and everyday life. If memory identity is essential, cognitive degradation becomes a deep moral problem. Should society restructure caregiving, advance early intervention treatments, or reconsider the moral weight we place on a person's rights or autonomy as their autobiographical continuity fades? If bodily continuity is the anchor, then life extension and radical forms of cognitive enhancement gain a new urgency and a new set of ethical questions about whether altering or preserving cognitive function in a changing body simply delays the inevitable, or whether it creates new forms of personhood that deserve recognition and protection. If psychological continuity proves sufficient even when the substrate changes dramatically, as functionalist or digitized substrate models might propose, we are confronted with the possibility that identity could be simulated or digitally replicated, challenging conventional rights, responsibilities, and moral accountability. In all these variations, the central task is to articulate what it would take to count as the same self in a manner that coheres with ordinary moral judgments, and with the lived experience of persons who navigate life under conditions of change, memory loss, or extraordinary cognitive capabilities. To push the conversation further, consider a more speculative line. radical life extension and cognitive enhancement invite us to imagine a future in which identity engineers choose to preserve or transplant minds, to connect minds to machines, or to reconstitute a person's mental life in novel substrates. Would such beings count as the same person? If a mind's structure can be preserved in a digital medium while the body withers, is there a meaningful continuity of the self? Parfit's framework would likely respond that the continuity of psychological connections, memory, preferences, and the ability to form new connections with the world constitutes a form of survival, even if the material substrate is new. The memory of a life would travel, in some sense, through the networks that carry information and intention, even if the old neurons and their chemistry no longer stand in for them. A bodily continuity account might respond with caution, arguing that the physical continuity of a living organism is essential for genuine personhood, and that the transformation from carbon to silicon, so to speak, may produce a different kind of entity, one that has its own moral life but not the same one. These are not merely philosophical curiosities. They push us to clarify what we mean by responsibility, by consent, and by the rights a person retains as the boundaries of selfhood shift. In a more grounded sense, the questions about identity bear directly on everyday ethics and social life. If a person's future self is to be treated with the same respect as the present self, then we must consider how to structure choices, commitments, and duties across the span of a life. The paradox of procrastination, doing or delaying a decision today because the future self may be different or less reliable, becomes not only a matter of self-control, but of meta-identity. Which version of you will bear the consequences of today's actions? If memory and psychological continuity remain central to the self, then one might argue for more careful planning and for policies that support the long arc of human flourishing. If, on the other hand, identity is sustained by the stability of character and dispositions in concert with functional continuity, then the solution to procrastination might lie in building consistent routines, in shaping environments that align daily choices with long-term goals, and in ensuring that the future agent remains in dialogue with the present one through social and moral structures that keep the line of reasoning coherent. In this light, two practical questions arise. How do cultures cultivate a stable sense of personhood as people age or as minds are altered by illness? And what kind of immortality, if any, would be meaningful to someone who must weigh the value of life against the costs and burdens of preservation? Some may imagine physical immortality as a straightforward extension of the body's life, a direct continuation of the current self in a physically permanent format. Others may imagine digital immortality, an uploaded mind persisting in a computational medium, perhaps as a new form of self that still carries the old desires, memories, and values, but inhabits a different environment. Still others may imagine a memorial immortality, the cultural memory that outlives the individual, preserving the person's influence, works, and relational reach through time. Each of these modalities of persistence carries its own ethical demands, questions about consent, about how to honor the living's needs and the dead's memory, about the fairness of access to posthumous forms of life, and about the responsibilities we bear toward those who come after us, our descendants, our communities, and future moral agents who will inherit a world shaped by our choices. In navigating these waters, it helps to bring back to the fore the role of memory, not as a solitary anchor but as a hub in a network of ties. Memory binds us to our past actions, to the people who stood with us, to the values that guided us, and to the plans we set for ourselves. Yet memory can falter. It can be reorganized by new experiences, by trauma, or by disease. If memory is a fragile thread, the drama of personal identity may be unraveling in some cases while remaining intact in others. Bodily continuity offers a sturdier physical claim to persistence, but it is not the only path. The brain's plasticity means that altered patterns of connectivity can still support a life of meaning, even if the original form of the mind has mutated beyond recognition. Psychological continuity, including the core of character and the long arc of preferences, stands at the center of Parfit's claim that what matters is the linkage of one life to another, not necessarily the transfer of the exact same mental tissue across time. In this sense, identity can be thought of as a project of keeping a life coherent across contingencies, a project of preserving the meaningful self through memory, through the body's continuity, and through the deeper consistency of a person's aims. To close with a few anchors for reflection, let us consider two prompts that you can carry with you as you sit with these questions in the quiet hours of your day. First, how would you define your own identity in moments of loss or near loss? When memory flickers or when a loved one forgets themselves, what remains of the person you know? Is it a stable core, a set of patterns, or a living relation to others? Second, what kind of immortality would be meaningful to you? physical, digital, or memorial, and why? If you could choose, would you want a form of persistence that preserves the same person, or would you be satisfied with a continuity of values, a trace of virtue, and the memory of what you have contributed to others being kept alive in a community long after your body is gone? In the end, the debate about personal identity across time is not a single correct answer, but an invitation to live more carefully with the idea that who we are is both anchored in what we remember and shaped by what we can endure. It invites us to look at the mind's fragile, astonishing machinery and to choose how we want to enact our lives within the limits of time and the possibility of change. It asks us to consider death not as a single event that ends a life, but as a turning of a page in a larger narrative, one that includes memory's reach, the body's endurance, the mind's continuity, the community that sustains us, and the potential for a form of life that may extend beyond the known limits of physical existence, or may not, depending on the frameworks we adopt. Socrates saw death as perhaps the most significant test of a life lived well, a threshold that could be crossed with equanimity when a life of inquiry and virtue had prepared one's soul. The Stoics urged a similar discipline. Cultivate a steadfast inner framework so that whatever change and loss come, the self remains a rational agent living in accordance with nature. The Buddhists, offering a different map, invite us to loosen our grip on a fixed self and to recognize the ever-shifting, interdependent processes that compose a life. All of these lenses, in their own ways, ask us to reimagine what it means to persist, and to reimagine what, if anything, persists. The questions remain urgent. What constitutes a person's identity across time? Is psychological continuity the decisive factor, or does bodily continuity have a claim? Can we coherently speak of an afterlife without preserving the same person, or is survival a matter of ethical continuity, relational continuity, or something that transcends personal identity altogether? As you listen to these strands, you are listening to centuries of human longing to be understood, to endure, to do right by others, and to remain coherent in a world where change is the only constant. The debates are not abstract curiosities. They shape how we approach memory, how we plan for the future, how we respond to cognitive decline, and how societies design care, law, and policy for those who live with the fragility and potential of a conscious life. They invite us to consider what kind of life is worth living, what kind of legacy we wish to leave, and what it might mean to be called a person when time itself seems to stretch, bend, or finally close. If you take away one thread from this journey, let it be this: identity is not a simple label attached to a mind or a body. It is a living, evolving narrative that we pursue with care, that we justify with reason, and that we guard with compassion for ourselves and for others. The tension between memory and body, between continuity and change, between present self and future self, remains one of the most intimate and enduring inquiries in philosophy of death. It is precisely in the tension that we find the opportunity to meet loss with wisdom, to recognize that a life can endure in meaningful ways even as the signs of personal continuity shift under pressure. The question, finally, is not only about whether a self can survive the grave or be preserved in some other form. It is about how we live now, in time, with the awareness that every moment we extend the thread of our memory, and every choice we make shapes the texture of the life we leave behind. If you found yourself pausing, leaning into a thought that made you look at your own life with new care, you are doing something right. This is not a lecture to be filed away and forgotten, but a conversation to revisit in your own terms. Consider the ideas of memory, of the body, of the mind, and of the possible or imagined afterlives as a way to examine not only what makes you who you are, but how you wish to become more fully yourself. The path through these questions is not merely a path of intellectual satisfaction. It is a path toward living with intention, toward facing aging, illness, and death with a facilitated sense of meaning, toward choosing how to care for others and how to shape the life you are still allowed to lead. And so we leave with two directions for your own contemplation. First, reflect on the events of your day and the months and years ahead. Where does your sense of identity most reliably reside? Is it your memories, your abilities, your relationships, your commitments, or a combination of these? And how might you guard and nurture the aspects of yourself that you value most as your life continues to unfold? Second, imagine your preferred form of immortality, if any. Do you gravitate toward a continuation of the physical body, a digital life, or a lasting memorial in the memories and actions of those who remain? What do you hope such persistence would preserve? Your values, your influence, your love, your curiosity, or something else altogether? The answers to these prompts are not simple products of argument. They are living commitments that inform how you think, how you treat others, and how you live with the knowledge that time will carry you forward, whether you want it to or not. And if in the quiet of a late-night pause you hear the whisper of these questions again, you are doing something essential. You are courting awareness of the deepest, perhaps the most practical, philosophical issue of all, the question of who you are as time continues and whether you will continue in any sense that matters to you and to those you love.